Hi guys. Tonight we step into a quiet world of ice and silence where the air feels still and ancient, and the ground beneath your feet holds secrets older than memory itself. You find yourself standing in a vast frozen landscape, the horizon stretching endlessly in pale shades of white and soft blue. The wind moves gently across the surface, carrying faint whispers that seem almost like echoes from another time. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you feel like it, share where you are in the world and what time it is for you right now. It is always calming to imagine this quiet journey, connecting people across different nights and different places. Now dim the lights and you begin to walk slowly forward, your steps soft against the frozen ground. The cold air brushes lightly against your skin, not harsh, but steady, like a quiet reminder of how different this world once was. Beneath your feet, layers of ancient ice stretch deep into the earth, holding within them tiny pockets of air that have not been touched for tens of thousands of years. In modern science, researchers study these frozen layers in places like Antarctica and Greenland, where ice cores act almost like time capsules. Each layer represents a year, sometimes even a season, quietly recording changes in the atmosphere. It is a widely accepted fact that these ice cores allow scientists to reconstruct past climates with surprising precision. You pause for a moment, imagining how each thin line in the ice marks a passing year, like pages in a book that no one has fully read yet. And somewhere within these frozen pages there is something missing. As you continue walking, you notice how the landscape feels both empty and full at the same time. Empty because there are no visible signs of life. Full because everything around you holds information quietly waiting to be understood. There is a faint crunch beneath your feet with each step. The sound feels soft, almost comforting, as if the world itself is careful not to disturb the silence too much. You might wonder how scientists even begin to notice something missing in a timeline so vast. The answer lies in patterns. Normally, when researchers examine these layers, they expect to see gradual changes. Warmer periods followed by colder ones. Shifts in gases like carbon dioxide and methane that reflect life on Earth. But occasionally they find abrupt changes. Moments where the pattern breaks. Some researchers continue to question whether these sudden shifts represent brief natural events or something much larger and more complex. You kneel, slightly brushing your hand across the surface of the ice. It feels smooth and firm with a faint texture that catches the light. Beneath it, deeper layers remain hidden, each one older than the last. A lesser-known detail is that tiny bubbles trapped inside the ice can contain actual samples of ancient air. When scientists extract and analyze them, they're quite literally breathing in a fragment of the past, though carefully, of course. It is a strange thought. Air that once surrounded early humans, now sealed away for tens of thousands of years, waiting quietly until someone comes along to listen to its story. You stand again and look out across the horizon. The light here is soft and diffused, as if the sun itself is hesitant to fully reveal itself. The sky carries a pale glow and the world feels suspended in a kind of gentle stillness. In times like these, it becomes easier to imagine how fragile life can be. Long before cities, before farms, before written language, humans lived closely with the environment. Their survival depended on small changes, a slight drop in temperature, a shift in rainfall, the movement of animals across the land. Even a minor disruption could ripple outward, affecting everything. And yet there are moments in Earth's history where the changes were not minor at all. You begin to walk again slower, now your breath steady and calm. The air feels clean, almost too clean, like it has been untouched for a very long time. Some historians suggest that during certain prehistoric periods, human populations were already small and widely scattered. Groups lived far apart, rarely interacting with one another. This made them especially vulnerable to sudden environmental shifts. Others disagree, proposing that early humans were more adaptable than we often assume, capable of adjusting to difficult conditions with surprising resilience. As you move forward, you notice subtle variations in the ice beneath you. Faint lines, slight changes in colour, almost like shadows layered within the frozen surface. Each one tells a story. Some layers are darker, filled with traces of volcanic ash carried by winds from distant eruptions. Others are clearer, formed during quieter times when the atmosphere remained stable. And then there are layers that seem different, not entirely absent, but thinner, less defined, as if something interrupted the usual rhythm of time. You pause again, letting the quiet settle around you. It is not an obvious gap, not a dramatic absence, more like a missing sentence in a long and continuous story. Easy to overlook at first, but once noticed impossible to ignore. In modern life we're used to constant records. Photos, videos, written accounts, all capturing every moment. But in this ancient world there are no such records, only indirect traces. Ice, stone, bone, and even those can only tell part of the story. You take a slow breath, feeling the cool air fill your lungs. It carries no scent, no hint of vegetation or life, just a clean, quiet emptiness. And yet somewhere far in the past this same air would have been filled with subtle signs of life, smoke from distant fires, the faint scent of animals moving across the land, the quiet presence of early humans navigating their world. You begin to imagine them, small groups moving carefully across vast landscapes, watching the sky, listening to the wind, learning slowly how to survive. It is a comforting image in some ways, but it also raises a quiet question. What happened during the time when those traces begin to fade? Why do some layers of history feel thinner, quieter, harder to understand? Researchers continue to explore these questions using new technologies and methods to uncover more details. But even with all the advancements of modern science, there are still moments where the evidence feels incomplete, as if something important slipped through unnoticed. You take another step forward, then another, the rhythm steady and unhurried. The frozen world around you remains calm, unchanged, holding its secrets without urgency. And perhaps that is part of what makes it so intriguing. There is no rush here, no pressure to solve everything at once. Just a quiet invitation to observe, to reflect, and to accept that some parts of history remain gently out of reach. You continue walking, the soft crunch beneath your feet becoming almost rhythmic now. And as you move deeper into this silent landscape, you begin to sense that this is only the beginning. A first glimpse into a chapter of Earth's history that feels both distant and strangely close. A chapter that is not entirely lost, but not fully understood either. You continue forward, leaving behind the endless ice, though its quiet presence lingers in your mind like a soft echo. The world around you begins to shift almost gently, as if time itself is guiding you backward into something older, warmer, and more alive. The cold fades. Not entirely, but enough for you to notice a difference. The ground beneath your feet is no longer frozen solid. Instead, it feels firm yet slightly uneven, a mixture of soil and stone shaped by countless seasons. The air carries a faint scent now, something earthy, something real. You find yourself standing in a landscape that feels more familiar to early human life. Wide open plains stretch into the distance, dotted with low grasses that move slowly in the breeze. A few scattered trees stand quietly, their branches thin and uneven, offering only limited shelter. The sky above is broader here, brighter, though still softened by a hazy light that suggests a world not entirely stable. This is a time before cities, before roads, before anything that resembles the structures you know today. A widely accepted understanding is that early humans during this period lived as hunter-gatherers, moving in small groups and relying entirely on their surroundings for survival. They did not stay in one place for long. Instead, they followed food, water, and seasonal patterns, always adapting, always adjusting. You begin to walk slowly across the plain, your steps light your awareness, tuned to the quiet details around you. The grass brushes gently against your legs. The ground shifts slightly under your weight. Somewhere in the distance you hear the faint call of an animal, low and distant, blending into the open air. There is life here, not abundant but present. You notice a cluster of stones arranged in a subtle circle. At first it seems random, but as you step closer, it becomes clear that this is not natural. The stones have been placed with intention. A fire once burned here. The ground within the circle is darker, slightly charred, though time has softened its edges. This small detail offers a glimpse into daily life, a quiet reminder that humans once gathered here, perhaps resting, perhaps sharing food, perhaps simply watching the sky as it shifted from day to night. A lesser-known detail is that many early human camps left behind only the faintest traces like these simple stone arrangements. Unlike permanent structures, they were not built to last. They existed for a moment, served their purpose, and were abandoned. Which means that what you are seeing now is rare, a small survival of something that usually disappears. You crouch slightly, running your fingers across one of the stones. It feels smooth, worn by time, but still solid. And you might wonder how many people once sat here. 5 perhaps, 10 at most. Early human groups were often small, sometimes no more than a handful of individuals moving together. This limited size helped them survive. It allowed them to remain flexible, to move quickly, to avoid exhausting the resources around them. But it also meant something else. They were fragile. You stand again, looking out across the plain. If something disrupted this environment even slightly, it would not take much to affect groups like this. A change in rainfall, a shift in temperature, the disappearance of animals they depended on. Each of these could ripple outward quietly but significantly. Some historians suggest that early humans were constantly living at the edge of survival, never entirely secure, always dependent on conditions they could not control. Others argue that this view may underestimate their resilience. They point to evidence of adaptability of tools evolving, of strategies improving over time. As you walk further, you notice more signs of life. Footprints, faint but visible in a patch of softer ground. They are not recent, but they're clear enough to follow for a short distance. The shape is unmistakable, human. You follow them slowly, your steps careful not to disturb what remains. The footprints lead toward a slight rise in the land where the grass grows thinner and the soil becomes more exposed. From there, the view opens even wider, revealing more of the surrounding landscape, and it becomes clear how vast this world is. No boundaries, no walls, just open space in every direction. It feels peaceful, but also isolating. In modern life, you are rarely this alone. Even in quiet places, there is usually some sign of others nearby. A distant sound, a faint light, something to remind you that you're not entirely separate. Here that reassurance is missing, and for early humans this would have been their normal. A quirky detail is that some early human groups likely communicated over long distances using simple sounds or signals, though evidence for this remains limited. It is an idea that researchers continue to explore, trying to understand how isolated groups might have stayed aware of one another. You pause at the top of the rise, letting your gaze drift across the land. In the distance, you notice movement. Small figures, barely visible, moving slowly along the edge of a dry riverbed. You do not approach them. You simply observe. They move with purpose, but without urgency. Each step measured, each action deliberate. They carry little, only what they need. Their bodies are lean-shaped by constant movement and effort. This is daily life. Simple, demanding, quietly complex. You watch as they pause near the riverbed, examining the ground, perhaps searching for water, perhaps tracking animals that passed through earlier. Water sources like this were essential. Even a small stream could determine where a group stayed and how long they remained. Without it, movement became necessary again, and movement always carried risk. You take a slow breath, feeling the air move gently through your lungs. It is warmer here, but still mild, still balanced on the edge of something uncertain. You begin to notice something else. The sky. There is a faint haze that seems slightly out of place. Not heavy, not overwhelming, but present enough to soften the light in a subtle way. It is easy to ignore, but once you notice it, it lingers. Some researchers continue to question whether early environmental changes may have begun gradually, almost unnoticed at first, before becoming more significant over time. Others suggest that certain events may have appeared suddenly disrupting conditions in ways that would have been impossible for early humans to predict. You look back at the small group in the distance. They continue their quiet search, unaware of what may come, or perhaps aware in ways that are difficult to fully understand. Early humans were closely connected to their environment. They observed patterns, they noticed changes. They adapted as best they could. But even the most attentive observer cannot prepare for everything. You turn slowly, letting your view return to the open plain behind you. The wind moves gently through the grass, creating soft waves that ripple outward. The land feels calm, balanced, yet there is a quiet sense that this balance is fragile, that something somewhere in this timeline will shift, and when it does, it will leave behind traces that are difficult to fully piece together. You take another step forward, continuing your slow journey through this ancient world. The ground beneath your feet feels steady. The air remains soft, but the story is already beginning to change, and you move gently with it. You continue walking across the open plain, the soft rhythm of your steps blending with the gentle movement of the wind through the grass. The world still feels calm, still balanced in a quiet way that almost invites you to relax completely. But as you move forward, something begins to feel different. Not immediately obvious, not something you can point to right away, just a subtle shift like a note slightly out of tune in an otherwise steady melody. The air feels a little drier now. The faint scent of earth is still there, but it has become thinner, less present. You notice it most when you pause and take a slow breath, as if the land itself is slowly losing something it once held. You continue walking, your gaze drifting across the landscape, looking for signs of life. There are fewer now. The distant animal calls you heard earlier seem more spaced out, less frequent. The small movements in the grass are harder to spot. Even the wind feels quieter, as if it carries less with it. A commonly accepted observation among researchers is that during certain prehistoric periods, environmental changes could lead to noticeable declines in local biodiversity. When conditions shifted even slightly, plants and animals would respond sometimes gradually, sometimes more abruptly. You begin to notice patches of land where the grass grows unevenly. Some areas remain soft and green, others look thinner, more brittle, with a faint yellow tone creeping into the colour. You crouch down and touch the ground. The soil feels drier than before, less compact, more fragile beneath your fingers. It would be easy to overlook this. After all, landscapes change all the time. But when you step back and look at the pattern, the difference becomes clearer. Something is beginning to fade. You stand again and continue forward, your pace slow and steady. In the distance, you see another set of footprints, though these are less defined than the ones you followed earlier. The edges are softer, partially erased by wind and time. You follow them for a short while, but they do not last long. They simply disappear. Not because they end, but because the ground no longer holds them. And that small detail feels strangely important. A lesser-known detail is that the preservation of footprints in ancient environments depends heavily on moisture and soil conditions. When the ground becomes too dry or too unstable, even recent traces can vanish quickly, leaving behind little evidence of movement. You pause, looking down at the place where the footprints fade. It is a quiet kind of disappearance. No sudden break, no clear ending, just a gradual loss. And you begin to sense that this is not just about footprints. You look out again across the plains. The horizon still stretches wide, but the details feel softer now, less distinct. The haze in the sky has grown slightly thicker, muting the light in a way that feels gentle but persistent. The sun is still there, but it seems distant, as if its warmth is being filtered through something unseen. You might wonder how early humans would have interpreted a change like this. They would not have had scientific explanations. No measurements, no instruments, only observation, an instinct. Some historians suggest that early humans relied heavily on subtle environmental cues to guide their decisions. Changes in animal behavior, shifts in plant growth, even variations in the sky could influence when they moved, where they settled, and how they survived. Others argue that while these observations were important, they may not always have been enough to anticipate larger, more complex changes. You begin walking again, your steps slower now, as if you're moving more carefully through a world that is quietly becoming uncertain. You notice another small cluster of stones ahead, similar to the one you saw earlier, but this one feels different. The arrangement is less clear, more scattered, as if it was not maintained for long. There are faint signs of burning, but weaker, less defined. You step closer. The The ground here is uneven, disturbed in a way that suggests brief use rather than a longer stay. Perhaps this group did not remain here for very long. Perhaps they moved on quickly. A widely accepted understanding is that mobility was essential for early human survival, especially in changing environments. When resources became scarce, staying in one place could be dangerous, so they moved, often without knowing exactly what they would find next. You stand quietly imagining the moment this place was abandoned, a fire allowed to fade, tools gathered, footsteps turning away, no certainty, only movement. And you begin to notice how many places feel like this, used briefly, then left behind. As you continue forward, the land opens into a wider expanse, but it feels emptier now. The small signs of life that once dotted the landscape are harder to find. Even the wind seems to move differently, slower, heavier, carrying a faint dryness that lingers on your skin. You take a slow breath, feeling the subtle difference in the air, and you begin to understand something important. This is not a dramatic event, not a sudden collapse. It is quieter than that. A gradual fading, a slow thinning of presence, the kind of change that is easy to miss at first but impossible to ignore once it becomes clear. Researchers continue to question how quickly such changes could unfold. Some suggest that environmental stress may have built up over time, affecting ecosystems in subtle ways before reaching a tipping point. Others propose that certain regions may have experienced sharper shifts, creating uneven patterns across the landscape. You look out again, searching for movement, for signs of the small group you saw earlier, but they are no longer visible. Whether they moved beyond your view or simply blended into the distance, it's hard to tell, and that uncertainty feels fitting. You begin to walk once more, your pace steady, your awareness focused on the quiet details around you. The grass continues to thin. The soil grows lighter in colour. The sky remains softly dimmed, and everything feels just a little less certain than before. You might not have noticed it at the beginning, but now it is clear. Something is changing, not loudly, not dramatically, but steadily. And as you move deeper into this landscape, you begin to sense that this quiet shift is leading somewhere, toward a moment in history where the story becomes harder to follow, where the traces grow faint, where the presence of humanity itself begins to feel less visible. You take another slow step, then another. The world remains calm, still, almost peaceful, and yet beneath that calm something is quietly slipping away. You continue forward, the quiet rhythm of your steps now softened by the changing ground beneath you. The landscape feels more fragile than before, as if each part of it is slowly adjusting to something unseen. The grass has thinned even further. In some places it disappears entirely, leaving behind patches of bare soil that crack faintly under your weight. The colour of the earth has shifted too, taking on a pale, dusty tone that reflects the light in a muted, almost tired way. You pause for a moment and look around. There is still a sense of openness here, still that wide horizon stretching into the distance. But the details have changed. The small signs of life that once filled the space now feel scattered, uncertain, as if they are holding on rather than thriving. Before moving further, it helps to understand the broader conditions shaping this world. During certain prehistoric periods, large-scale environmental disruptions were not uncommon. Shifts in climate, volcanic activity, and changes in atmospheric composition could all influence how ecosystems behaved. These changes did not always happen all at once. Sometimes they unfolded over years, even centuries, quietly altering the balance of life. You begin walking again, your steps slower now, your attention drawn to the ground. Something catches your eye, a darker layer of soil exposed along a small slope. You move closer and kneel, brushing away a thin layer of loose dust. Beneath it, the ground reveals a distinct band slightly darker than the surrounding earth, with a texture that feels finer, almost powdery. It is subtle but unmistakable. Traces of ash. A lesser-known observation is that microscopic volcanic ash can travel vast distances carried high into the atmosphere, before settling across entire regions. Even areas far from an eruption site can bear its signature preserved quietly in the soil. You run your fingers lightly across the surface. It feels soft, almost like fine sand, but with a dryness that lingers. This is not from a small fire. This is something larger. You stand slowly looking out across the landscape again. At first it seems unchanged, but now that you have seen it, you begin to notice similar layers in other places. Thin, scattered bands of darker soil, sometimes barely visible, sometimes more pronounced. Each one a quiet marker. Each one a reminder that something happened here. You take a slow breath, the air now carrying a faint dryness that settles gently in your throat. It is not unpleasant, just different. And you might wonder how early humans would have experienced something like this. They would not have seen the ash fall from the sky in every case. In some regions it may have arrived as a fine dust settling slowly, almost invisibly. At first it might have gone unnoticed. Then gradually the effects would begin to appear. Plants struggling to grow, water sources becoming less reliable, animals changing their movement patterns. Some researchers suggest that volcanic events in prehistory may have had far-reaching consequences affecting climates and ecosystems far beyond their immediate surroundings. Others point out that the exact scale and impact of these events can be difficult to determine, especially when relying on indirect evidence. You begin to walk again, your gaze scanning the land more carefully now. There are fewer signs of recent activity. The small clusters of stones you noticed earlier are absent here. No clear fire circles, no visible traces of repeated human presence. It feels quieter, not in a peaceful way, but in a way that suggests absence. You step over a patch of cracked soil, the surface breaking slightly under your weight. The sound is faint but distinct, like something that has been dry for a long time. In modern terms, we might compare this to drought conditions where moisture becomes scarce and the land begins to lose its ability to support life. But here there are no forecasts, no warnings, no explanations, only experience, only observation. You pause again, letting your senses adjust. The wind has changed slightly. It carries a fine texture now, almost imperceptible, brushing lightly against your skin. When you raise your hand, you can just barely see tiny particles catching the light before drifting away. More ash, not heavy, not overwhelming, but present. You lower your hand, slowly watching as the particles settle back into the ground. It is easy to imagine how this would affect daily life. Food sources becoming less predictable, water tasting different, the air itself feeling unfamiliar. You begin to picture a small group of early humans moving through this same space, their steps cautious, their awareness heightened. They would notice these changes. They would feel them, and they would have to decide what to do. Some evidence suggests that early human groups often responded to environmental stress by moving to new areas seeking more stable conditions. Yet there is ongoing discussion about how far they could travel and how quickly they could adapt to entirely new environments. You continue walking the landscape now, stretching out in a quieter, more subdued form. There is a stillness here, but it is not the same stillness as before. It feels heavier, more settled, as if the land itself is holding on to the memory of something significant. You come across a shallow depression in the ground where the soil appears slightly darker and more compact. You step closer. There are faint impressions here. Not clear footprints, but subtle disturbances that suggest movement. Perhaps a group passed through here once. Briefly, long enough to leave a trace. Not long enough to leave much more. You stand quietly imagining that moment. A pause in their journey. A brief stop to assess their surroundings. A decision to move on. You look up again, letting your eyes follow the horizon. The sky remains softly dimmed, the light filtered in a way that never fully brightens. And you begin to sense that this is not just a local change. This is something broader, something that stretches beyond what you can see. Researchers continue to explore how interconnected these environmental changes may have been. Some propose that large volcanic events could have triggered cooling periods, altering weather patterns across entire regions. Others suggest that multiple factors may have worked together, creating complex and overlapping effects. You take a slow breath, feeling the air settle gently in your chest. The world around you remains calm, but it is no longer balanced in the same way. It feels as though it is adjusting, recovering, or perhaps still reacting. You begin to walk once more, your steps steady, your pace unhurried. The ash beneath your feet blends quietly into the soil, becoming part of the landscape, part of the story. And as you move forward, you carry with you the quiet awareness that something powerful has passed through this world, something that left its mark not in loud, obvious ways, but in subtle layers, in quiet changes, in the gradual fading of what once was. You continue walking your steps slow, and even the soft texture of the ground shifting gently beneath your feet. The ash you noticed before now feels more integrated into the land, less obvious, but still present like a memory that refuses to fully fade. The air has changed again. It feels slightly heavier now, not in a way that presses against you, but in a way that lingers. Each breath feels softer, yet somehow less clear, as if something invisible is resting within it. You lift your gaze toward the sky. The light is still there, but it has dimmed further. The sun appears as a pale diffused glow, its edges blurred by a thin veil that stretches across the atmosphere. It is not darkness, not even close, but it is not the clear open sky you might expect. Before you move further, it helps to understand what conditions like this could mean. In certain prehistoric periods, large volcanic eruptions released enormous amounts of ash and gases into the atmosphere. These particles could spread across vast distances, forming a layer that reduced the amount of sunlight reaching the Earth's surface. This process is sometimes linked to short-term cooling events that affect both climate and ecosystems. You take a slow breath, noticing how the light touches the land around you. Everything appears softer, muted. The colours of the grass, the soil, even the distant trees seem slightly faded, as if the world has been gently dimmed. You begin to walk again, your eyes adjusting to the subdued brightness. The ground here feels more compact, as if it has been pressed down over time. There are fewer signs of fresh growth. The plants that remain appear smaller, their leaves thinner, their shapes less vibrant. A small cluster of shrubs catches your attention. You move closer and crouch beside them. Their leaves are dry at the edges, curling slightly inward. When you touch one, it feels fragile, almost brittle, as if it might break with too much pressure. A curious detail is that volcanic ash, while harmful in the short term, can sometimes enrich soil over longer periods. Yet immediately after an event, it often creates harsh conditions for plant life, blocking sunlight and altering the chemistry of the ground. You stand again, letting your hand fall gently to your side. This is not a thriving landscape. It is a landscape adjusting to something new. You begin to notice how quiet it has become. Earlier there were distant animal calls, faint movements in the grass. Now those sounds are rare. Occasionally you hear something far away, but it is brief, isolated, and quickly swallowed by the stillness. You walk a little further, your steps carrying you toward a shallow valley, where the ground dips slightly before rising again. From here the view expands, but the emptiness becomes more noticeable. There are fewer signs of recent movement, no clear tracks, no fresh disturbances. It feels as though life has retreated, pulling back into smaller, less visible spaces. You pause at the edge of the valley, letting your eyes scan the terrain, and then you see it. A faint trail, not of footprints, but of disturbed earth leading across the valley floor. You follow it slowly, your steps careful, your attention focused. The trail is uneven, broken in places, but it suggests that something moved through here not long ago. Perhaps a small group. Perhaps animals. It is hard to tell. You kneel and examine the ground more closely. There are faint impressions, but they are shallow, almost incomplete. The soil does not hold shape as easily now. It crumbles slightly under your touch. You might wonder how early humans managed in conditions like this. They relied on observation, on experience, on memory. They would notice the changes in the sky, the shifts in temperature, the behavior of animals. They would feel the difference in the air, even if they could not explain it. Some researchers propose that sudden environmental dimming events could have created periods of uncertainty for early human groups, forcing them to adapt quickly or move to more stable regions. Others suggest that the effects may have varied greatly depending on location, with some areas experiencing more severe disruption than others. You stand again, following the faint trail as it leads toward a small rise on the opposite side of the valley. As you climb, the ground becomes slightly firmer though, still dry. At the top you pause and look back. The valley stretches out below you, quiet and subdued, the muted light giving everything a soft, almost distant quality. You look up once more at the sky. The haze is more noticeable now. It spreads evenly, diffusing the sunlight in a way that feels constant, unchanging. It is not something that comes and goes. It is something that stays, and you begin to imagine what it would feel like to live under a sky like this for days, weeks, perhaps longer. No clear sunlight. No bright warmth, only this steady, dim glow. In modern life, we might compare it to an overcast day that never fully clears. But even that does not quite capture it, because here there is a sense that the sky itself has changed, not just the weather. You take a slow breath, feeling the air settle within you. And then you notice something else. The temperature. It is subtle, but there is a slight coolness now, a gentle drop that becomes more apparent the longer you stand still. Not cold. Not yet, but cooler than before. You wrap your arms lightly around yourself, more out of awareness than discomfort. This change combined with the dimmed light begins to form a clearer picture. The environment is shifting, quietly, steadily, in ways that affect everything at once. Plants, animals, humans. You begin walking again, your steps slower, your awareness deeper. Each part of the landscape now feels connected to this larger change. The dry soil, the brittle leaves, the quiet air, the dim sky, all of it part of the same unfolding story. You pass another small patch of exposed earth, where the ash layer is visible again, thinner this time but still present. It blends into the soil, becoming part of it, changing it. And you realize something important. This is not a moment that comes and goes. This is a period, a stretch of time where conditions remain altered, where life must adjust or struggle or move. You continue forward, the horizon still open, still distant. The world remains calm, still, almost peaceful. But beneath that calm, the change is undeniable. The light is dimmer, the air is heavier, the land is quieter. And as you move deeper into this shifting world, you begin to sense that this is only the beginning of something larger, something that will leave behind traces not easily understood. Something that will one day become part of a missing chapter. You continue walking beneath the dim sky, your steps steady, your breath slow and even. The world around you feels quieter than before, as if everything has settled into a softer rhythm. The light remains muted, the air remains still, and yet there is a growing sense that you are approaching something important. Before you go further, it helps to understand one of the most significant events often linked to this kind of environmental change. Around 74,000 years ago, a massive volcanic eruption occurred at Lake Toba, located on the island of Sumatra, in what is now Indonesia. This event is known as the Toba super eruption, and it's considered one of the largest eruptions in Earth's recent geological history. You pause for a moment, letting that settle in your mind. An eruption so powerful that it reshaped the land itself, so powerful that its effects may have reached across continents. You take a slow breath and continue walking. The ground beneath your feet feels slightly firmer now though. Still dry, still carrying traces of ash that blend quietly into the soil. The landscape stretches out ahead, but it feels more subdued than ever, as if something has pressed gently against it, dimming its energy. A widely accepted scientific understanding is that eruptions of this scale can release vast amounts of ash and sulfur gases into the atmosphere. These materials can form a high-altitude layer that reflects sunlight away from the Earth, leading to a period of cooling sometimes referred to as a volcanic winter. You look up again at the sky. The haze you noticed earlier now feels more significant. It's not just a thin veil, it is part of the environment, a constant presence that softens the light and reduces its warmth. You might wonder what it would feel like to live through such a moment, not knowing what caused it, not knowing how long it would last, only experiencing the changes day by day. You continue forward your steps, slow your awareness drawn to the quiet details around you. The plants here are even more sparse. Small patches of vegetation cling to the ground, but they appear weaker, their growth limited. The soil, though still stable, lacks the richness you might expect in a thriving ecosystem. You crouch beside a small plant, observing its thin leaves. They are pale, delicate. When you touch one, it bends easily, offering little resistance. A lesser-known detail is that volcanic ash in the atmosphere can reduce the amount of sunlight available for photosynthesis. This can affect plant growth on a large scale, especially in the period immediately following a major eruption. You stand again, letting your gaze drift across the land. There is movement in the distance. Slow. Careful. A small group of animals moving along the edge of a low ridge. Their pace is measured, their bodies lean, their movements cautious. You watch them for a moment. They stop, occasionally lowering their heads searching for food. But they do not linger. They move on. It is a quiet reminder that survival here requires constant adjustment. You begin walking again, your steps following the gentle slope of the land. The air feels slightly cooler now. Not sharply, but enough that you notice it when the wind brushes lightly against your skin. You wrap your arms loosely around yourself, more aware of the temperature than before. Some researchers propose that the Toba eruption may have led to a noticeable drop in global temperatures, though the exact extent and duration remain subjects of ongoing study. While some models suggest a dramatic cooling, others indicate a more moderate effect. You continue forward the ground, rising gradually beneath your feet. At the top of the rise, you pause and look out. The landscape stretches far into the distance, but it feels emptier than ever. Fewer animals, fewer signs of movement. Even the wind feels quieter, as if the world itself is conserving energy. You take a slow breath, letting the cool air fill your lungs, and you begin to imagine how early humans might have experienced this. Small groups already spread thin across vast territories, now facing a world that offers less warmth, less food, less certainty. They would have noticed the sky, the dim light, the cooler air. They would have felt the difference in their bodies in the way the days unfolded. Some evidence suggests that human populations during this period may have been reduced significantly, leading to what is sometimes called a population bottleneck. However, there is continuing discussion about how severe this reduction truly was, and whether it occurred uniformly across different regions. You begin walking again, your steps slow and deliberate. The land here feels quieter still. You pass a small cluster of stones, but unlike earlier ones, there is no clear sign of a fire. No darkened soil, no arrangement that suggests repeated use. It feels abandoned, or perhaps never fully used at all. You pause briefly, then continue on. The sky above remains unchanged. The haze persists. The light stays soft and distant, and the temperature continues its gentle decline. You notice how your breath feels slightly cooler as it moves in and out, how your skin responds to the subtle shift. It is not uncomfortable. Not yet, but it is noticeable. You walk toward a shallow depression in the land where the ground dips and the soil appears slightly darker. There is a faint trace of moisture here. Not much, but enough to support a few small plants clustered together. You kneel and touch the ground. It feels cooler, slightly damp, a small pocket of stability in an otherwise changing environment. You might wonder how important places like this would have been. Water sources, sheltered areas, small regions where conditions remain just a little more favorable. For early humans, these places could make the difference between staying and moving on, between survival and uncertainty. You stand again, looking out across the landscape, and you begin to understand something quietly profound. This event, whatever its full impact, is not just a single moment. It is a period of adjustment, a time when the world shifts and everything within it must respond. Plants adapt or fade, animals move or struggle. Humans observe, decide and act. You take another slow step, then another. The rhythm of your movement remains steady. The world remains calm, but the changes are now undeniable. The dim sky, the cooler air, the quieter land, all of it connected, all of it part of something vast. And as you continue forward, you carry with you the quiet awareness that this may be one of the turning points in the long story of humanity, a moment when survival was not guaranteed. A moment that may have left behind only faint traces that you are now walking through. You continue moving forward, the ground rising gently beneath your feet, before leveling out into another wide stretch of open land. The air feels cooler now, not sharply so, but enough that you notice it lingering on your skin a little longer than before. The sky remains softly dimmed, the light never quite brightens, and everything around you seems to move at a slower, more careful pace. You pause for a moment and take a steady breath, letting your eyes adjust to the subtle stillness of this world. Before stepping further, it helps to place yourself within the larger picture. At times in Earth's deep past, environments have shifted in ways that placed enormous pressure on living systems. Cooling temperatures, reduced sunlight, and altered weather patterns could combine to reshape entire ecosystems. These changes did not always announce themselves clearly. Often they unfolded quietly, influencing life in gradual but persistent ways. You begin walking again, your steps measured, your attention drawn to the small details that remain. There are fewer plants here than before. Those that do remain appear scattered and low to the ground, their shapes modest, their growth restrained. You pass a cluster of grass that barely reaches your ankles, its colour faded into a dull green that leans toward grey. When the wind brushes across it, the movement is gentle, almost hesitant. You notice how quiet everything has become, not silent, but subdued. The occasional sound of movement still exists, but it is faint and distant, as if life itself is conserving energy. You take a few more steps and notice something else. Tracks. Not human this time. Animal. But they are shallow, uneven, and difficult to follow. The ground does not hold their shape clearly. The edges blur into the surrounding soil as if time is erasing them, almost as soon as they appear. You crouch down and study them. The spacing suggests a steady pace, not a hurried one, but there is something about the direction that feels uncertain, slightly irregular. A small but interesting observation is that animals under environmental stress often change their movement patterns, sometimes travelling farther or more unpredictably in search of food and water. These shifts can leave subtle clues in the landscape, though interpreting them is not always straightforward. You stand again and follow the faint tracks for a short distance. They lead toward a low cluster of rocks where the ground becomes firmer and less affected by the dry conditions. Beyond that, they disappear. You stop letting your gaze move across the horizon. The openness of the land remains, but it feels emptier than before. You might wonder how early humans experienced this kind of change. They would not have seen a single event, not a clear beginning or end. Instead, they would have lived through a series of small differences. Days that felt slightly colder, food that became a little harder to find, journeys that grew longer. Some researchers have suggested that this period may have placed significant pressure on early human populations, reducing their numbers in certain regions. Others propose that the impact may have varied widely, with some groups adapting successfully, while others faced greater challenges. You begin walking again, your pace slow and steady. The wind shifts slightly, brushing across your face with a cooler touch. It carries very little scent now, almost none at all, as if the richness of the environment has thinned along with everything else. You wrap your arms loosely around yourself again, more aware of the temperature than before. It is not uncomfortable, just noticeable. You pass another patch of exposed soil where faint traces of ash still blend into the ground. The layer is thinner here, almost indistinguishable from the surrounding earth unless you look closely. And that feels important. The signs are still present, but they are fading. You take a slow breath, letting the quiet settle around you. And then you notice something in the distance. Movement, very faint. A small group of human figures barely visible against the muted landscape. You remain still observing. They move slowly, their steps careful, their formation loose but connected. There are only a few of them, perhaps 6 or 7 each, carrying minimal belongings. They pause, occasionally scanning the ground, the horizon, the sky. Their movements are deliberate, focused. You watch as one of them bends down, examining something on the ground, perhaps searching for signs of water or food. The others wait, their bodies still, their attention alert. This is not a relaxed pace. It is a cautious one. A subtle but meaningful detail is that early human groups often relied on collective awareness, with individuals sharing observations and decisions to improve their chances of survival. Cooperation was not just helpful, it was essential. You remain where you are, allowing them to continue their quiet journey. After a few moments, they move on, gradually fading into the distance, until they become part of the landscape once more. You begin walking again, your steps soft against the ground. The sky above remains unchanged, The light stays dim, the temperature continues its gentle decline, and the world feels as though it is holding its breath. You might find yourself wondering how long this period lasted. Days, years, generations. For those living within it, time would not have been measured in precise units. It would have been felt through experience, through memory, through change. You pass a small rise in the land and climb it slowly, your legs moving in a steady rhythm. At the top you pause and look out again. The view stretches endlessly, but the sense of life feels thinner than ever. Fewer animals, fewer signs of movement, fewer traces of recent activity. And yet the world is not empty. It is simply quieter, more restrained. You take a slow breath, letting the cool air settle within you. And you begin to understand something more clearly. This is a world under pressure, not collapsing, not ending, but adjusting in a way that challenges everything within it. You take another step forward, then another. The rhythm continues. The calm remains. But beneath it, the change is constant. And as you move deeper into this landscape, you carry with you the quiet awareness that survival here depends on something more than strength. It depends on awareness, on patience, on the ability to adapt even when the path forward is uncertain. You continue forward, your steps soft, and measure the ground beneath you, now carrying a faint firmness that feels both reassuring and uncertain at the same time. The world remains calm, but the calm has changed in character. It feels thinner, as if it rests on something fragile. The air is cooler again, not sharply, not enough to cause discomfort, but enough that you notice it each time you pause. It lingers along your arms, across your face, settling gently into your awareness. You look around. The openness of the land remains, but there is less movement than before. The distant shapes that once suggested life have become rarer, more difficult to find. The horizon still stretches wide, but it feels quieter, less active, as if fewer stories are unfolding within it. To understand this moment, it helps to consider how populations behave under environmental strain. When conditions become more difficult, living groups often spread out or diminish in number. Resources grow scarce, and the distance between individuals or communities can increase. This does not always happen suddenly. Often it is a gradual thinning, a quiet reduction that becomes noticeable only over time. You walk slowly across a patch of ground where the soil appears smoother than before, less disturbed by recent activity. There are no clear footprints here, no fresh tracks, only a surface that has remained untouched for some time. You pause, letting your gaze drift across the land, and you begin to notice how empty it feels. Not completely, but more than before. You take a slow breath, the cool air settling gently in your chest, and you begin to imagine what this would mean for early humans. Small groups already separated by distance, now finding fewer signs of others, fewer shared paths, fewer overlapping territories. A small but meaningful observation is that in periods of environmental difficulty, human populations can become fragmented, with groups moving independently rather than maintaining regular contact. This fragmentation can reduce the exchange of knowledge, tools, and cultural practices. You begin walking again, your steps careful, your awareness focused on the quiet details around you. You come across a slight depression in the ground where the soil appears darker and more compact. You move closer and kneel, brushing your fingers across the surface. There are faint impressions here, very faint, not enough to clearly identify, but enough to suggest that something passed through. Perhaps a group, perhaps only one or two individuals. The impressions are incomplete, broken, as if the ground itself could not hold their shape for long. You sit back slightly, considering what you see. It is not absence, not entirely, but it is reduced presence, and that difference feels important. Some researchers have proposed that during periods linked to major environmental stress, early human populations may have declined significantly, possibly to a few thousand individuals worldwide. Other researchers caution that such estimates are difficult to confirm as the available evidence remains limited and open to interpretation. You stand again, looking out across the landscape. The wind moves gently, carrying very little with it. No strong scent, no clear sound, just a soft, steady motion. You begin walking toward a low ridge in the distance, your pace slow, your breathing even. As you move, you notice something else. The ground shows fewer signs of repeated use. Earlier you saw areas where movement had clearly passed more than once. Now each trace feels isolated, singular, as if paths are no longer shared. You reach the ridge and climb it slowly. At the top you pause and look out. The view is wide, expansive, but it feels empty in a way that is difficult to ignore. You search the horizon for movement, for signs of life. There are few, very few. A distant animal moving slowly across the far edge of the plain. A brief flicker of motion near a cluster of rocks, but nothing like before. You take a slow breath, letting the stillness settle around you, and you begin to understand how isolation might have shaped this moment. For early humans, connection was not guaranteed. Groups might go long periods without encountering others, and in a time like this, those encounters may have become even rarer. A curious detail is that genetic studies suggest modern humans share a relatively narrow range of variation, which some scientists interpret as evidence of a past population reduction. However, the timing and cause of this pattern remain subject of ongoing investigation. You begin walking again, descending the ridge with careful steps. The ground here feels slightly more stable, but still dry, still lacking the richness of earlier landscapes. You pass another small patch of vegetation, but it is sparse, its growth limited. You reach down and touch one of the leaves. It feels thin, delicate, as if it is using only the smallest amount of energy to remain alive. You stand and continue forward. The sky above remains unchanged. The light stays dim. The air stays cool, and the world feels quieter than ever. You might find yourself wondering how long this quiet lasted, how many generations lived within it, how many adapted, how many did not. You take another slow breath, letting the air move gently through you, and you continue walking. The rhythm remains steady, the calm remains present, but beneath it the sense of reduction is undeniable. Fewer traces, fewer signs, fewer connections. And as you move deep into this landscape, you begin to sense that you are not just witnessing a change in environment. You are witnessing a change in presence, a thinning of life itself, not disappearing completely, but becoming smaller, more scattered, more fragile. You take another step, then another. The ground remains steady, the air remains cool, the sky remains dim, and the silence stretches on. You continue forward your steps, steady your breath. Slow the quiet landscape unfolding around you in soft muted tones. The world feels more delicate now, as if everything within it is conserving energy, holding on rather than growing. The air carries a clearer chill. It is still gentle, still manageable, but it lingers longer on your skin, especially when the wind moves across the open land. You notice it along your hands, your face, a subtle but persistent coolness that was not as present before. You pause and look across the horizon. The openness remains, but the life within it feels thinner still. Before moving further, it helps to understand how climate shifts like this can influence entire systems. When temperatures drop even slightly, the effects ripple outward. Plants grow more slowly. Water sources may freeze or become less reliable. Animals must adapt, migrate, or struggle to survive. Each of these changes builds upon the others, creating a network of challenges that affect everything connected to the land. You begin walking again, your steps quiet against the firm, dry ground. Ahead you notice a shallow stream, or what used to be one. The path it carved is still visible, a winding line cutting through the soil, but the water itself is barely present. Only a thin trickle remains moving slowly along the lowest part of the channel. You move closer and kneel beside it. The water is clear but shallow, its movement slow, almost hesitant. You dip your fingers in briefly. Cold, noticeably so. A small but telling observation is that even minor cooling periods can reduce the availability of liquid water in certain regions, especially in areas already sensitive to seasonal change. This can place additional pressure on both plant and animal life. You sit back slightly, watching the faint movement of the stream. It continues, but just barely. You stand and follow its path for a short distance. Along its edges you notice small patches of vegetation slightly greener than the surrounding land. These plants cling to the moisture, drawing what little they can from the thin flow of water. It is enough to survive, but not enough to thrive. You continue walking, leaving the stream behind as it narrows further and eventually disappears into the dry soil. The land beyond feels even quieter. The wind has softened again, carrying almost no sound. You listen carefully. Nothing immediate, only a faint, distant echo of movement that fades quickly. You take a slow breath, letting the stillness settle around you, and you begin to imagine what it would feel like to rely on this environment every day. To wake each morning not knowing if water would still be there. To move across land that offers less with each passing season. Some researchers suggest that access to reliable water sources would have been one of the most critical factors influencing early human movement during periods of environmental stress. Others emphasize that adaptability, including the ability to use different food sources, may have played an equally important role. You continue forward your steps, carrying you toward a slightly elevated area, where the ground rises gently. As you climb, you notice the soil becoming more compact, less prone to breaking under your weight. At the top you pause and look back. The stream you followed is now barely visible, a thin line in the landscape, easy to miss. You turn your gaze outward again. The land stretches far, but it feels quieter than ever. You search for signs of movement, for animals, for people. There are a few distant shapes, very small, moving slowly, but they are far apart from one another, separated by wide spaces that feel almost empty. You might find yourself wondering how often early humans encountered others during this time. Days apart, weeks, perhaps longer. A curious detail is that in sparse populations, encounters between groups could become rare events, yet they remained important for sharing knowledge, exchanging tools, and maintaining social connections. The balance between isolation and interaction would have been delicate. You begin descending the rise your steps, careful, your awareness focused. The ground here feels slightly colder, not just the air but the land itself. You place your hand briefly against the soil. It feels firm, cool, almost as if it is holding onto the lower temperature more strongly than before. You stand and continue walking. The sky above remains unchanged. The dim light persists. The haze shows no sign of lifting, and the temperature continues its gradual decline. You wrap your arms loosely around yourself again, not out of discomfort, but out of awareness. The change is steady, consistent. You pass another stretch of land where the vegetation is nearly absent. Only bare soil and scattered stones remain. You slow your pace, letting your eyes move carefully across the surface. There are no fresh tracks here, no signs of recent passage. It feels untouched, or perhaps abandoned. You take a slow breath, feeling the cool air fill your lungs, and you begin to understand something more deeply. This is not just a reduction in life. It is a redistribution. Life is not gone. It is concentrated, gathered in smaller pockets where conditions remain just barely suitable. Everywhere else it has thinned. You continue walking your steps soft, your rhythm steady. The quiet remains. The calm remains. But beneath it the strain is clear. The land offers less. The water is scarce. The temperature is falling. And everything must respond. You take another step, then another. The horizon remains distant. The sky remains dim, and the silence stretches on, carrying with it the quiet weight of a world adjusting to change. You continue forward your pace, unhurried, your breath steady, the quiet landscape unfolding with a kind of gentle persistence. The world feels more fragile now, as if every part of it is carefully balancing what remains. The air carries a deeper chill. It is still soft, still not harsh, but it settles into your skin in a way that lingers. When the wind passes, it feels cooler than before, brushing across your face with a subtle sharpness that was not there earlier. You pause and look around. The openness remains, but the sense of presence continues to thin. The distant movements you once noticed are now rare, almost uncertain, as if life itself is becoming harder to find. Before you move further, it helps to consider how scientists today understand this period. Genetic research offers one of the most intriguing windows into the past. By studying patterns in human DNA, researchers can estimate how populations changed over time. These patterns sometimes suggest moments when the number of individuals dropped significantly, leaving behind a narrower genetic diversity in future generations. You begin walking, again your steps soft against the firm ground. The soil here feels colder underfoot, holding the temperature of the air more closely. The landscape stretches outward in muted tones, the colours subdued, the details softened by the dim light above. You notice a small cluster of stones ahead and move toward it. Unlike earlier formations, this one appears more deliberate. The stones are arranged in a loose circle with a faint darkening at the centre. A fire once burned here. You crouch and run your fingers lightly across the ground. The soil is darker in the middle, though the edges have faded with time. An interesting detail is that repeated use of fire sites can leave behind chemical traces in the soil that persist long after the visible signs have disappeared. Even when a campsite looks abandoned, it can still carry subtle evidence of human activity. You sit back slightly, imagining the people who once gathered here. A small group, close together, sharing warmth, sharing food, sharing awareness of the world around them. You stand again and look out across the land, and you begin to notice something. There are no other nearby signs of similar activity. No overlapping camps, no repeated paths. This place feels isolated. You take a slow breath, letting the cool air settle in your chest, and you begin to understand how important isolation might have been during this time. Some scientists propose that early human populations may have passed through a genetic bottleneck, where the total number of individuals dropped to a relatively small figure. This idea is supported by certain patterns found in modern human DNA. Yet there is ongoing discussion about how severe this reduction truly was and whether it affected all populations equally. You begin walking again, leaving the small fire site behind. The ground slopes gently downward, leading you into a shallow basin where the air feels slightly heavier. The temperature dips just a little more. You notice it in your breath, in the way your hands feel. Not uncomfortable, but undeniable. You pause and look at the ground. There are faint impressions here, footprints, human, but they are scattered uneven, not part of a clear path. Some face one direction, others another, as if the group moved unpredictably. You follow them slowly. They lead toward a cluster of rocks at the edge of the basin where the ground becomes firmer. There the prints fade, not because they end, but because the surface changes. You stand still for a moment, considering what you have seen. A small group, moving through, not staying long. You might wonder how often such movements occurred. How many groups were moving like this across landscapes that offered less with each passing season? A curious point is that in small populations, even slight changes in numbers can have significant effects on long-term survival. The loss or gain of just a few individuals can influence the stability of an entire group. You turn slowly, letting your gaze sweep across the basin. It feels quiet, still, almost empty, and yet you know it is not entirely so. Life remains, but it is scattered, reduced, carefully distributed across the land. You begin walking again, your steps soft, your awareness deepening. The sky above remains dim. The haze shows no sign of clearing. The light continues to feel distant. You wrap your arms loosely around yourself once more out of habit now than necessity. The coolness has become part of the environment, part of the rhythm. You climb out of the basin and return to slightly higher ground. From here the view opens again. The horizon stretches wide, but the sense of connection between places feels weaker. Each area seems separate, self-contained. You take a slow breath, letting the stillness settle around you, and you begin to feel something else. Not fear, not urgency, but awareness, a quiet understanding that this moment in history is delicate, that the balance of life has shifted, and that survival depends on navigating this new reality. You take another step, then another. The rhythm continues, the calm remains, but beneath it the story deepens. Fewer traces, fewer encounters, fewer signs of a world once more connected, and as you move forward you carry with you the quiet sense that humanity at this point in time may be closer to its limits than it has ever been. Not gone, not lost, but reduced to something smaller, something more fragile, something that must endure quietly through a world that has changed. You continue walking your pace slow, and even the quiet world around you, unfolding with a steady, almost gentle consistency. The air feels cooler than before, settling lightly against your skin, and the dim light above gives everything a softened, distant quality. Nothing feels rushed, nothing feels sudden, and yet something important is becoming clearer. You move across a stretch of ground that feels more solid under your feet, less brittle than earlier patches, though still dry. Small stones are scattered across the surface, their edges worn smooth, their presence quiet and unremarkable. You pause and look out across the land. There are fewer signs of life now than ever before. Not gone entirely, but reduced to occasional movement in the far distance. Before continuing, it helps to consider how scientists interpret what may have happened during this period. The idea of a population bottleneck has been proposed as one possible explanation. This concept suggests that at some point in the past, the number of humans may have dropped significantly, leaving only a small group to carry forward the genetic line. This interpretation comes largely from genetic studies, which show relatively low variation among modern humans compared to many other species. You begin walking again, your steps soft against the ground. The wind moves gently, brushing across the landscape with a faint, cool touch. It carries almost no scent, now only a clean, empty feeling that lingers for a moment before fading. You notice a small rise ahead and move toward it, your pace steady. As you climb, the ground becomes slightly more uneven, small dips and ridges forming a subtle pattern beneath your feet. At the top you pause and look out. The view stretches far, but what stands out is not what you see, it is what you do not see. No nearby groups, no clear signs of recent activity, only distant, isolated movement that fades quickly into the horizon. You take a slow breath, letting the stillness settle around you, and you begin to imagine how different this world must feel compared to earlier times. A simple but meaningful observation is that smaller populations tend to be more vulnerable to change. With fewer individuals, the ability to recover from losses becomes more limited, and the margin for survival becomes narrower. You begin descending the rise, your steps careful, your awareness focused. At the base, you notice a faint trail of disturbed soil leading toward a narrow path between two low rock formations. You follow it slowly. The path feels enclosed compared to the open land you have been crossing. The rocks on either side offer a slight barrier from the wind, creating a space that feels more sheltered. You step into it and pause. The air here is still, quieter, slightly warmer, only by a small amount but enough to notice. You look down and see faint impressions in the soil, footprints, human, more defined than those you saw earlier. You crouch and examine them closely. They are not fresh, but they are clearer, suggesting that this area has been used more than once. A subtle detail is that sheltered environments can preserve traces of activity more effectively, protecting them from wind and erosion. This makes them valuable sources of information for those trying to understand past human behavior. You stand and look around. This place feels different, not lively, but used. A passage, a temporary refuge. You imagine a small group moving through here, perhaps stopping briefly to rest, to gather themselves, to share quiet observations before continuing on. You begin walking again, following the narrow path as it winds gently between the rocks. The ground remains firm, the air still. For a moment the outside world feels distant, and in that moment you begin to sense how important places like this might have been. Small pockets of stability, areas where conditions were just a little more manageable, where the wind was less harsh, where the cold was less noticeable. Some researchers suggest that during challenging environmental periods, humans may have relied more heavily on such micro-environments, using them strategically to improve their chances of survival. Others note that evidence for this behavior is still limited and open to interpretation. You reach the end of the narrow path and step back into the open land. The difference is immediate. The wind returns. The coolness settles in again. The dim light stretches across the horizon. You pause for a moment, letting your senses adjust, and then you continue walking. The land ahead remains wide and quiet. The signs of life remain few. The patterns of movement remain scattered. You take a slow breath, feeling the air move gently through you, and you begin to understand something more clearly. This is not just a period of environmental change. It is a test, a quiet, ongoing test of survival, for plants, for animals, for humans. You take another step, then another. The rhythm continues. The calm remains, but beneath it the stakes feel higher. Each movement matters. Each decision matters. Each small group carries with it the future of its own line. You walk forward the horizon, still distant, the sky still dim. And as you move deeper into this quiet world, you carry with you the growing awareness that humanity at this moment may be balanced on a very narrow edge, not falling. Not yet, but closer than ever before. You step out from the narrow passage and return once more to the open land, your pace slow, your breathing steady. The wind greets you again, brushing lightly across your face, carrying that same cool, quiet presence that has followed you for some time now. The sky remains dim, the light remains soft, and the world feels carefully balanced as if it is holding itself together with quiet effort. You continue walking, your attention drawn to the terrain ahead. The ground begins to shift slightly, rising and falling in gentle patterns. Small ridges form natural boundaries, creating pockets of space that feel more contained than the wide plains behind you. You move toward one of these areas, your steps deliberate. As you enter, you notice something different. The air feels less exposed here. The wind is softer, and the ground carries faint signs of repeated use. You pause and look around. This place has been visited before. Not frequently, but more than once. Before exploring further, it helps to consider how early humans responded to conditions like these. When environments became less predictable, finding even small areas of relative stability could make a meaningful difference. Sheltered spaces, access to limited water, or even slight protection from wind could influence where people paused, rested, or gathered. You walk slowly across the area, scanning the ground. There are stones here arranged loosely, not in a perfect circle, but with a sense of purpose. The centre is slightly darker, the soil marked by past heat. A fire once burned here. More than once. You crouch and touch the ground lightly. It feels compact, slightly smoother than the surrounding land, as if it has been pressed down over time by repeated presence. A subtle but interesting observation is that early human shelters were often temporary, sometimes using natural features like rocks or shallow depressions rather than built structures. These spaces rarely leave obvious remains, making them difficult to identify unless conditions preserve them carefully. You sit back slightly, imagining the scene. A small group gathered here, close together, their movements quiet, their voices low, the fire providing warmth, light, and a sense of security in a world that offers less with each passing day. You stand again and look outward. From this slightly sheltered position, the landscape feels distant, almost softened by the low ridges that surround you. It is not complete protection, but it is enough to feel different. You begin to notice faint impressions in the soil, footprints, more than one set. They overlap in places, suggesting repeated visits, not constant, but enough to form a pattern. You follow them, slowly tracing their paths as they move across the space. Some lead toward the centre near the fire, others lead outward toward the open land, movement in and out, a place of brief return. You might wonder how important such places were during times like this, how often groups found themselves coming back to the same location, relying on its small advantages. Some researchers suggest that during periods of environmental stress, early humans may have developed more flexible patterns of movement, revisiting certain locations when conditions allowed. Others propose that constant movement remained the dominant strategy, with little opportunity for repeated use of specific sites. You walk to the edge of the sheltered area and pause. The wind becomes more noticeable again. The cool air returns. The dim light stretches across the horizon. You take a slow breath, letting the difference settle within you. Inside the shelter there was a slight sense of stability. Outside the world feels broader, but also more uncertain. You step back out into the open land and continue walking. Your pace remains unhurried. Your awareness remains focused. The ground beneath your feet feels firm but dry, the texture consistent with what you have felt for some time now. You pass another small patch of vegetation, though it is sparse, its growth limited. You reach down and touch one of the stems. It bends easily, almost too easily. A small detail worth noting is that plants under prolonged stress often reduce their growth and conserve energy, focusing on survival rather than expansion. This can lead to landscapes that appear stable at first glance but are actually under strain. You stand and continue forward. The sky remains unchanged. The haze persists. The light stays muted. You wrap your arms loosely around yourself again, aware of the coolness that has become a constant companion. As you walk, you begin to notice how quiet the world has become, not just in sound, but in activity. The land feels still in a deeper way now, as if fewer events are unfolding within it. You look out across the horizon. There are no visible groups, no clear signs of movement, only the faint suggestion of life far in the distance. You take a slow breath, letting the stillness settle around you, and you begin to understand something more clearly. This is a time of waiting, not waiting for something to happen suddenly, but waiting through a period of change that unfolds slowly, steadily over time. You take another step, then another. The rhythm continues. The calm remains, but beneath it the sense of pressure is constant. The land offers less. The air feels cooler. The light feels distant. And yet life continues, quietly, carefully, adapting with each passing day. You walk forward, the horizon still wide, the sky still dim. And as you move deeper into this world, you carry with you the quiet awareness that survival here is not about strength alone. It is about finding small advantages, small moments of stability, small places where life can continue even when everything else feels uncertain. You continue forward, leaving the sheltered hollow behind you, your steps soft against the dry ground. The wind returns in gentle passes, cool and steady, brushing across your face and hands with a quiet persistence that now feels familiar. The sky remains unchanged. A pale glow filters through the haze. The light never quite sharpens, and the world carries on in this muted, careful state. You walk slowly across the open land, your attention drawn once again to the subtle details that define this place. The soil beneath your feet feels firm, though not rich. Small stones shift slightly as you move, their faint sounds blending into the quiet rhythm of your steps. Ahead you notice something that feels different, a darker patch of ground, not large, but distinct enough to stand out against the pale surface around it. You move toward it with steady curiosity. As you approach, the shape becomes clearer, a shallow depression ringed loosely by scattered stones with a center that bears the faint signature of repeated heat. You crouch down. Another fire site, but this one feels more used than the others. The soil is darker, the texture smoother. The stones slightly more arranged, as if they have been adjusted more than once. To better understand this, it helps to consider the role of fire in early human life. Control of fire is widely recognized as one of the most important developments in human history. It provided warmth, protection, and a way to prepare food, making it central to survival, especially in cooler or unstable environments. You run your fingers lightly across the ground. There is a faint residue here, subtle but present, a quiet trace of repeated burning. An interesting detail is that some ancient fire sites contain layers of ash and charcoal built up over time, indicating that certain locations were returned to again and again, even in otherwise mobile lifestyles. You sit back slightly imagining what this place must have been. A point of return, not permanent, but reliable, a place where a small group knew they could find some degree of familiarity. You stand again and look around. The openness of the land stretches outward, but this small space feels grounded, almost anchored in a way that the surrounding terrain does not. You begin to notice faint pathways leading toward and away from the site. Not clear trails, but repeated directions, subtle impressions left by movement over time. You follow one of them for a short distance. It leads toward a slightly elevated area where the ground becomes more exposed, the soil thinner, the stones more numerous. From here the view opens again, and you pause. Looking out, you search for signs of life. There are very few, a distant movement barely visible, a small shift in the landscape that suggests something living but far away. You take a slow breath, letting the cool air settle within you. and you begin to consider how important places like that fire site must have been. In a world where conditions are uncertain, familiarity becomes valuable. Returning to a known location even briefly can offer a sense of stability. Some researchers suggest that early humans may have developed mental maps of their surroundings, remembering key locations such as water sources, shelter points, and safe resting areas. Others propose that movement was more reactive, guided by immediate conditions rather than long-term planning. You turn and walk back toward the fire site, your steps steady. As you arrive, you pause once more. The ground here feels slightly warmer than the surrounding soil. Not physically warm, but different in texture. More compact, more settled. You crouch again and place your hand gently against the earth. It holds together. It feels used. You might wonder how many times a group returned here, how many nights they spent gathered around the same small fire, how many quiet conversations unfolded in this exact place. A curious observation is that repeated use of specific sites can leave behind patterns that are only visible under close study, often requiring careful excavation to fully understand. You stand slowly and take a step back. The site remains still, quiet, holding its traces without revealing too much. You turn once more and continue walking, leaving it behind. The land ahead stretches open again, the sense of shelter fading as you move forward. The wind picks up slightly, brushing across the ground and carrying with it fine particles that catch the dim light before settling again. You notice how your breath feels cooler now, how the air lingers a little longer in your lungs. The change is gradual, but steady. You wrap your arms loosely around yourself, aware of the subtle shift. The temperature continues its gentle decline. You walk across another stretch of nearly barren land where vegetation is almost absent. Only small patches remain scattered and fragile. You pause and look out across the horizon. The quiet feels deeper now. Not just a lack of sound, but a lack of activity. A world that continues but at a slower pace. You take a slow breath, and you begin to understand something more clearly. Survival here is no longer just about movement. It is about memory. Remembering where to return, where to find small advantages, where to pause even briefly in a world that offers less with each passing day. You take another step forward, then another. The rhythm continues. The calm remains, but beneath it the importance of small places becomes clearer. Small fires, small shelters, small moments of stability. And as you move deeper into this quiet landscape, you carry with you the awareness that these small things may be what allow life to continue at all. You continue forward, leaving the familiar fire site behind your steps, slow, and even as the land stretches quietly ahead. The wind moves in gentle waves, brushing across the surface of the ground, and carrying that same cool touch that has become part of everything. The sky remains dim, the light remains soft, and the world continues in its careful balance. You walk across a wide-open stretch where the ground feels slightly firmer than before. The soil here is packed more tightly, with fewer loose fragments shifting under your steps. It gives the impression of a place shaped by repeated passage, though no clear paths remain. You pause for a moment and look out. The land feels broader here, more exposed, and yet more empty. Before you move further, it helps to consider how early humans found food in conditions like this. Hunting and gathering were not fixed routines. They required constant adjustment based on the availability of animals and plants. When environments shifted, so did the strategies people used to survive. You begin walking again, your eyes scanning the ground carefully. After a short distance, you notice a set of tracks. Animal, more defined than the ones you saw earlier. You move closer and crouch. The impressions are clearer here, the edges sharper, suggesting that the ground held their shape more effectively at the moment they were made. The spacing between them indicates movement at a steady pace, not hurried, not slow. You follow them, your steps careful. They lead across the open land, curving gently toward a shallow dip where the terrain lowers slightly. As you walk, you begin to notice additional signs. A broken stem, a small disturbance in the soil, subtle but connected. You are following a path that something living once took. A practical observation is that early humans relied heavily on tracking skills, using small environmental clues to follow animals over long distances. These skills required patience, attention, and an ability to interpret patterns that might seem almost invisible at first glance. You continue following the tracks as they descend into the shallow dip. The air feels slightly cooler here, the ground holding a bit more moisture than the surrounding areas. At the bottom you pause. The tracks become more scattered, less clear. You look around. There are signs of movement, but not in a straight line. The animal may have slowed here, perhaps searching for food or water. You notice a small patch of vegetation slightly greener than the rest. You step closer. The leaves are still thin, still fragile, but they hold a hint of life that feels stronger than what you have seen elsewhere. You imagine an animal pausing here, feeding briefly before moving on. You follow the tracks as they rise out of the dip on the other side. But after a short distance, they fade. Not abruptly, just gradually. The ground becomes too firm, too dry, and the impressions disappear. You stand still for a moment looking at the place where they vanish, and you begin to sense how difficult it must have been to rely on this method of finding food. Sometimes the trail is clear, sometimes it is not, and when it disappears you're left with uncertainty. Some researchers suggest that environmental stress may have made hunting more challenging, as animals changed their behavior or moved to different areas. Others propose that early humans adapted by broadening their diets, relying on a wider range of food sources when necessary. You take a slow breath and continue walking. The land ahead feels more exposed again. The wind moves more freely, carrying a slightly sharper coolness. You wrap your arms lightly around yourself, feeling the shift in temperature more clearly now. It is still manageable, but it is no longer subtle. You walk across another stretch of ground where the vegetation is sparse, the soil pale and dry. You pause and look out across the horizon. There is movement, far in the distance. A small group of animals moving slowly across the land. They are spread out, not clustered together, each one maintaining a small distance from the others. You watch them for a moment. Their pace is steady, deliberate. They do not linger, they move with purpose. A small but telling detail is that animals in difficult environments often travel greater distances to find food, which can reduce their population density and make them harder to track or hunt. You continue walking your steps, steady your awareness deep. The sky above remains unchanged. The haze persists. The light stays dim. You take a slow breath, letting the cool air settle within you, and you begin to understand something more clearly. Survival here is not just about finding food. It is about finding it consistently, knowing where to look, knowing when to move, and knowing when to stop searching in one place and try another. You walk forward, the ground firm beneath your feet. The world remains quiet, calm, but beneath it the effort required to live here is growing. Each step matters. Each decision matters. Each small success makes a difference. You pass another patch of land where the soil appears slightly disturbed, but there are no clear tracks to follow. Only hints. Only possibilities. You pause briefly, then continue. The horizon remains wide, the sky remains dim, and the quiet stretches on. As you move deeper into this landscape, you carry with you the growing awareness that every part of life here is becoming more demanding, more uncertain, more dependent on skill, memory, and patience. And yet life continues, carefully, steadily, moving forward just as you are now. You continue forward, your steps steady and unhurried, the rhythm of your movement, blending into the quiet stillness that surrounds you. The land stretches outward in soft, muted tones, the sky above holding its pale, diffused glow. The air feels cooler again, not sharply, but enough that you notice it more quickly now, as if your body has learned to recognize even the smallest shifts. Each breath carries that faint chill, settling gently in your chest before fading. You walk across a broad stretch of ground where the soil feels firm and slightly uneven, small ridges forming natural patterns beneath your feet. There are no clear signs of recent passage here, only a surface that has remained undisturbed for some time. You pause and look out across the horizon. There is very little movement, only distant shapes barely visible moving slowly across the far edges of the land. Before you continue, it helps to consider how early humans managed survival in conditions like this. They did not rely on strength alone. They relied on each other. Cooperation was not optional. It was essential. You begin walking again, your awareness shifting from the landscape itself to the idea of those who once moved through it. Small groups, close together, each individual depending on the others in ways that were immediate and constant. You notice a cluster of stones ahead and move toward it. As you approach, the arrangement becomes clearer. Another fire site, but this one feels slightly different. The stones are closer together, forming a tighter circle. The center is darker, more defined, suggesting repeated use over a short period of time. You crouch and touch the ground. It feels compact, well used. You imagine a group gathered here, not just passing through but staying for a little while, perhaps longer than usual. A simple but meaningful observation is that when conditions become more challenging, groups may stay together more closely, relying on shared effort to manage resources and maintain safety. You sit back slightly, picturing the scene. A few individuals tending to the fire, others watching the surrounding land, someone preparing food, someone resting, each role small but important. You stand again and look around. The openness of the land remains, but this place feels more concentrated, more focused. You begin to notice something else. Small fragments scattered around the site. Pieces of stone, some sharper than others. You pick one up carefully. It has a defined edge, a tool, simple but purposeful. A curious detail is that stone tools from prehistoric periods often show signs of repeated use and reshaping, allowing them to serve multiple functions over time. You turn the piece slightly in your hand, then place it back where you found it. You look around again. There are no large collections of tools, no piles, only a few scattered pieces, enough to suggest use, not enough to suggest abundance. You take a slow breath, letting the cool air settle within you, and you begin to understand something more clearly. Resources here are limited. Everything must be used carefully. Nothing can be wasted. You begin walking again, moving past the fire site and into the open land beyond. The wind picks up slightly, carrying a sharper edge than before. You feel it more clearly now, along your arms, across your face. The temperature continues its slow decline. You wrap your arms loosely around yourself, more aware of the change than before. You walk across another stretch of ground where the vegetation is sparse, the soil pale and dry. You pause and look out across the horizon. There is movement. Far away, a small group of human figures. You remain still observing. They move slowly, their formation close, their steps coordinated. They are not spread out. They stay together. You watch as one of them gestures, pointing towards something in the distance. The others respond, adjusting their direction slightly. Their movement is not random. It is shared. A small but important insight is that communication, even in simple forms, would have played a crucial role in coordinating group movement and decision-making. You continue watching as they move. After a short time, they disappear from view, blending into the landscape once more. You begin walking again, your steps steady, your awareness deep. The sky remains dim. The haze persists. The light stays soft and distant. You take a slow breath, feeling the cool air move gently through you. And you begin to sense how cooperation becomes more important as conditions grow more difficult, not just for finding food, but for sharing knowledge, for making decisions, for enduring together. You pass another small rise and climb it slowly. At the top you pause and look out. The land stretches wide, quiet, still, but not empty. You can sense life within it. Scattered, careful, connected in small ways. You take another slow breath, and you continue forward. The rhythm remains, the calm remains, but beneath it the importance of connection becomes clearer. Small groups, shared effort, quiet coordination. These are the things that allow life to continue here, even as the world becomes more demanding. You take another step, then another. The ground remains firm, the air remains cool, and the journey continues. You continue forward your pace, unhurried, your breathing steady, the quiet world stretching gently ahead of you. The land feels familiar now in its stillness, though each step reminds you that it is not the same as before. The air carries a persistent coolness. The light remains soft and distant, and everything seems to move at a slower, more deliberate rhythm. You walk across a wide stretch of open ground where the soil feels firm and slightly uneven beneath your feet. Small stones shift softly as you step, their faint sounds blending into the quiet around you. You pause and look out across the horizon. The distance feels vast, but what stands out most is the space between signs of life. Before continuing, it helps to place this moment within a broader pattern. During times of environmental pressure, movement becomes essential. When resources become limited, staying in one place for too long can reduce the chances of survival. Shifting location, even without certainty, can open new possibilities. You begin walking again, your steps steady, your awareness focused. Ahead you notice a gradual change in the land. The terrain becomes slightly more uneven, with gentle slopes and shallow valleys forming natural pathways. These features guide your movement without forcing it, creating routes that feel instinctive to follow. You move along one of these natural paths, your pace calm. As you walk, you begin to notice faint traces along the ground. Not clear footprints, but repeated disturbances, subtle impressions that suggest movement over time. You follow them, allowing your steps to align with the path. A small but meaningful observation is that early humans often used natural features of the landscape to guide their movement, following rivers, ridges, and valleys that provided easier travel and access to resources. You continue forward the path, leading you gently downward into a shallow valley. The air feels slightly different here. Still cool, but less exposed. The wind softens as the land rises slightly on either side. You pause and take a slow breath. There is a faint sense of shelter, not complete, but noticeable. You look around. There are small patches of vegetation here, more than in the open areas you have been crossing. The plants are still modest in size, still showing signs of strain, but they are more present. You step closer and touch one of the leaves. It feels thin, but alive, holding on. An interesting detail is that even in difficult climates, certain microenvironments can support more stable plant growth, offering small pockets of resilience within a larger area of stress. You stand again and continue walking. The valley curves gently guiding your path. You begin to notice more signs of movement. Faint tracks, broken stems, subtle disturbances in the soil. Nothing clear, but enough to suggest that others have passed through here. You follow these signs, your pace steady. As you move, you begin to imagine how important routes like this would have been. Paths that offered slightly better conditions. Paths that connected one resource to another. Paths that made movement just a little easier. Some researchers propose that early human migration patterns were influenced heavily by such natural corridors, shaping the way populations spread across regions. Others suggest that movement was more opportunistic, guided by immediate needs rather than established routes. You continue walking the valley, slowly rising ahead of you. As you climb, the wind returns, brushing across your face with a cooler edge. You feel it more clearly now. The temperature has dropped again, though still gradually. You wrap your arms loosely around yourself, aware of the shift. At the top of the rise, you pause and look out. The view stretches wide. The landscape beyond feels more open, but also more uncertain. Fewer signs of vegetation, fewer signs of movement. You take a slow breath, letting the air settle within you. And you begin to understand something more clearly. Movement is not just about leaving one place. It is about searching for better conditions, searching for stability, searching for survival. You step forward and begin descending the other side. The ground feels firmer here, though still dry. You pass another small patch of exposed soil where the ash layer is faintly visible, blending into the earth. A quiet reminder that the changes affecting this world are still present, still shaping everything. You continue walking, your steps steady, your awareness deep. The sky remains dim. The haze persists. The light stays soft and distant. You pause once more and look out across the horizon. There is movement. Very far away. A small group, moving slowly, following a path you cannot fully see. You watch them for a moment. Then they fade into the distance. You begin walking again. The rhythm continues. The calm remains. But beneath it, the sense of searching becomes clearer. Small groups moving through a changing world, following subtle paths, seeking small advantages, adapting step by step. You take another slow breath, and you continue forward. The land remains wide, the air remains cool, and the journey continues, guided by movement, memory, and quiet determination. You continue along the gentle path, your steps soft against the ground, the quiet rhythm of your movement blending into the stillness that surrounds you. The land stretches outward once more, opening into a wider space where the wind moves freely again. The air feels cooler now, not sharply, but steadily. Each breath carries a faint chill that settles in your chest before fading. The sky remains dim, the light remains distant, and the world continues in this careful, restrained state. You pause and look around. The openness feels familiar, but something about it has changed again. Before you move further, it helps to consider how tools shape survival during times like this. Early humans depended on simple tools for many aspects of daily life. Stone implements were used for cutting, scraping, and preparing food. These tools were not fixed objects. They were shaped, reshaped, and sometimes abandoned when no longer useful. You begin walking again, your eyes scanning the ground. After a short distance, you notice something small, a fragment of stone. You step closer and crouch. It has a sharp edge, not natural, shaped by intention. You pick it up carefully, turning it slightly in your hand. The edge is worn. An interesting observation is that many prehistoric tools show signs of repeated modification, where their edges were reworked to extend their usefulness. This allowed early humans to make the most of limited resources. You place the fragment back on the ground and stand. Looking around, you begin to notice more pieces. Scattered, not concentrated, each one separate from the others. You walk a few steps and find another, then another, each slightly different, each shaped by use, and then left behind. You pause, letting your gaze move across the area. This is not a single site, not a place of gathering. It feels more like a trail of activity, moments of use, moments of need, then movement. You begin to follow this subtle pattern, your steps aligning with the scattered pieces. They lead you across the open ground, though not in a straight line. The direction shifts slightly. The spacing varies, as if the movement that created this pattern was not planned in advance. A small but meaningful insight is that tool distribution in archaeological sites can sometimes reflect patterns of movement, showing how individuals or groups travelled and used resources along the way. You continue forward, the ground beneath your feet firm but dry. The wind moves steadily, carrying that familiar coolness. You notice how the air feels thinner now, not in a physical sense, but in presence. Less scent, less variation. You take a slow breath and continue. The scattered tools begin to appear less frequently. The pattern fades, and once again the land feels empty. You pause, looking out across the horizon. There is very little movement, very little sign of recent activity. You might wonder how early humans managed their tools in conditions like this. They could not afford to carry too much. Weight mattered, energy mattered. Every decision about what to keep and what to leave behind had consequences. Some researchers suggest that toolkits during periods of environmental stress may have become more simplified, focusing on essential functions. Others propose that flexibility remained key, with individuals adapting their tools based on immediate needs. You begin walking again, your steps slow and even. The ground rises gently ahead, forming a low ridge. You climb it with steady movement. At the top you pause and look out. The view stretches far. The landscape feels quieter than ever, but then you notice something, a faint line across the ground in the distance. You focus on it. It is subtle, but continuous. You begin walking toward it. As you approach, it becomes clearer. A path, not sharply defined, but present, a slight depression in the ground where repeated movement has worn the surface down. You step onto it and pause. The ground here feels smoother, more compact. You look along its length. It extends in both directions, fading gradually into the distance. You begin to follow it, your steps aligning with the subtle track. A thoughtful observation is that repeated use of certain routes can create enduring pathways even in environments where most traces fade quickly. These paths can reflect shared movement patterns across time. You walk along the path, your pace steady. The wind moves gently. The cool air remains. The sky stays dim. You take a slow breath, letting the rhythm settle within you, and you begin to understand something more clearly. Even in a world that feels scattered, disconnected, and uncertain, there are still patterns. Still connections, still traces of shared movement. You continue along the path, the ground guiding your steps. The silence remains, the calm remains, but beneath it the sense of continuity begins to return. Not strong, not obvious, but present. A quiet thread running through the landscape. You take another step, then another. The path continues, the journey continues. And as you move forward, you carry with you the awareness that even in times of difficulty, patterns of life persist. They may become faint, they may become scattered, but they do not disappear entirely. You continue along the faint path, your steps falling naturally into its shallow rhythm. The ground beneath your feet feels slightly smoother here, as if many quiet journeys have passed before yours, each one leaving just enough of a trace to guide the next. The air remains cool, the sky remains dim, and the world continues in this quiet, measured state. You walk slowly, letting your senses settle into the subtle details around you. The path curves gently, leading you toward a landscape that begins to shift once again. The ground rises and falls in broader waves, now the open plains giving way to more varied terrain. Small clusters of rock appear more frequently, and the soil shows faint differences in colour, as if the land itself is adjusting unevenly. Before moving further, it helps to understand how environments respond over time. When large-scale disruptions occur, ecosystems do not change uniformly. Some areas recover more quickly, while others remain altered for longer periods. This creates a patchwork of conditions where life adapts differently depending on the local environment. You continue walking your steps steady. As the path leads you forward, you begin to notice more vegetation. Not abundant, but present. Small shrubs, low grasses, scattered patches that feel slightly more resilient than what you've seen before. You pause beside one of these patches and crouch. The leaves are still thin, still showing signs of strain, but their colour is a little deeper, their structure a little stronger. A curious observation is that certain plant species are more tolerant of environmental stress, allowing them to survive and even begin to recover in conditions that would limit others. You stand again and continue walking. The path becomes less defined here, blending into the natural contours of the land. You follow it as best you can, though at times it disappears entirely. And yet you keep moving forward, trusting the direction, trusting the rhythm. You begin to notice something else. The air feels slightly different. Still cool, but with a faint hint of change. Not warmth, not yet, but less sharp than before. You take a slow breath, letting the sensation settle. It is subtle, easy to miss, but present. Some researchers suggest that after significant environmental disturbances, recovery can begin gradually with small improvements in local conditions appearing before larger patterns shift. Others caution that such signs can be temporary, with conditions fluctuating before stabilizing. You walk across a gentle slope, your steps careful. The ground here feels less brittle, holding together more firmly under your weight. You notice faint signs of animal movement again. Small tracks, more frequent than before, still scattered, but more visible. You follow them, briefly observing their direction. They seem to converge toward a slightly lower area ahead. You move toward it. As you approach, you notice a shallow basin where the soil appears darker and more compact. There is moisture here. Not much, but enough. You step closer and kneel. The ground feels cooler, slightly damp, and the vegetation around it is more present. Small plants cluster near the center, their leaves fuller, their shapes more defined. You sit back slightly, taking in the scene. This is a place where conditions have shifted, even if only a little. A place where life holds more firmly. An interesting detail is that even small increases in moisture availability can have a significant impact on local ecosystems, allowing both plant and animal life to become more active. You stand again and look around. There are more signs of movement here. Animal tracks crossing the basin. Faint impressions leading in multiple directions, a sign that this place is used. Visited, important. You begin to notice something else. Footprints. Human, faint but present. You follow them slowly. They move toward the center, then away again, suggesting a brief stop rather than a long stay. You pause, imagining the moment. A small group arriving, observing, perhaps gathering water. They're moving on, You take a slow breath, letting the quiet settle around you, and you begin to understand something more clearly. Recovery, even in the smallest form, creates new patterns, new points of connection, new places where life can gather. You stand and continue walking, leaving the basin behind. The land begins to rise again, the vegetation thinning once more as you move away from the moisture. The air cools slightly again. The wind returns with a soft, steady presence. You wrap your arms loosely around yourself, aware of the shift. You reach the top of another gentle rise and pause. The view stretches wide. The landscape ahead is still quiet, still subdued, but no longer as empty as before. There are small signs of life, scattered, careful, but present. You take a slow breath, and you continue forward. The rhythm remains steady. The calm remains, but beneath it there is a quiet sense of change. Not a sudden return, not a full recovery, but the beginning of something. Small, subtle, yet meaningful. You take another step, then another. The ground remains firm, the air remains cool, and the journey continues through a world that is slowly, carefully beginning to shift once more. You continue forward, your steps soft and even, the land unfolding in gentle patterns beneath a sky that still holds its quiet haze. The air feels familiar now in its coolness, though there is a faint sense that something is slowly easing. Not gone, but changing. You walk across a stretch of ground where the soil feels more stable than before, holding together with a subtle firmness. Small patches of vegetation appear more frequently, though they remain modest in size, their growth careful and restrained. You pause and look out across the landscape. There is movement, more than before, still distant, still quiet, but present in a way that feels slightly more consistent. Before you continue, it helps to consider how animals respond during periods like this. When environments shift, animal populations often change as well. Some species adapt and remain, while others move away or disappear entirely. These changes can reshape the balance of ecosystem in lasting ways. You begin walking again, your attention drawn to the ground. After a short distance, you notice tracks, clearer than before, more frequent. You crouch and study them. Different shapes, different sizes, multiple animals passing through the same area. A quiet but telling observation is that areas with improved conditions often attract a wider range of animal activity as species gather around available resources. You stand and follow the tracks, your steps steady. They lead you across the open ground toward a cluster of rocks where the terrain rises slightly. As you approach, you notice signs of feeding. Broken stems, disturbed soil, small fragments scattered across the surface. You pause, taking it in. This is a place of activity, not constant, but repeated. You might wonder which animals have disappeared during this time, which ones have remained, or which ones have adapted. An interesting point is that fossil records from certain prehistoric periods show gaps where some species seem to vanish, while others continue with little change. Interpreting these patterns is complex, and researchers often rely on limited evidence to piece together what may have happened. You continue walking, moving past the cluster of rocks. The land begins to open again, but it feels different now. Less empty, more varied. You notice more subtle movements in the distance. Small animals crossing open ground, bird-like shapes moving briefly against the dim sky. Each one a quiet sign that life is still present, still adjusting. Still continuing. You take a slow breath, letting the cool air settle within you, and you begin to sense that the world, while still under strain, is no longer at its lowest point. You walk toward a shallow incline, your steps steady. As you climb, the ground feels slightly warmer underfoot, not significantly, but enough to notice. You pause at the top and look out. The view stretches wide. The haze still softens the light, but there is a faint sense of clarity returning. You look closely. The horizon feels sharper, the outlines of distant features more defined. It is subtle, but present. Some researchers suggest that after major environmental disturbances, recovery can begin unevenly, with certain regions showing improvement earlier than others. Others emphasize that fluctuations may continue for long periods before any stable pattern emerges. You begin descending the slope, your steps careful. The ground here holds together well, supporting more consistent movement. You pass another patch of vegetation and reach down to touch it. The leaves feel slightly stronger, less brittle, still delicate, but improved. A curious detail is that even small changes in temperature or moisture can influence plant structure, allowing them to recover gradually over time. You stand and continue walking. The sky remains dim, but the light feels a touch more present than before. You notice how it reaches the ground a little more clearly, how it outlines shapes with slightly greater definition. You take a slow breath, and you continue forward. The rhythm remains steady, the calm remains, but beneath it the sense of quiet recovery becomes clearer. You pass another set of tracks, then another, each one reinforcing the same idea. Life is returning, carefully, gradually, not in large numbers, not all at once, but enough to change the feeling of the land. You pause once more and look out across the horizon. There are still wide spaces, still areas where little seems to move, but now there are also points of activity, small clusters of presence. You begin walking again, your steps soft, and you start to understand something important. Even after a period of great strain, life does not simply disappear. It adapts, it shifts, it finds new ways to continue. You take another step, then another. The ground remains firm. The air remains cool, but the quiet no longer feels as heavy as before. There is space within it now, space for movement, space for return. And as you move forward, you carry with you the awareness that this world of change is not finished. It is still becoming something new. You continue forward, your steps light and steady, the land stretching gently ahead, beneath a sky that still holds its quiet haze. The air feels familiar now, cool, but less sharp, settling around you in a way that no longer feels entirely uncertain. The light remains soft, but it feels slightly clearer, as if the world is slowly remembering how to brighten. You walk across a broad stretch of ground where the soil feels more stable than before, holding together with a subtle firmness that supports your movement. Small patches of vegetation appear more frequently now, though they remain modest and careful in their growth. You pause and look out across the horizon. There is movement, more than before, still distant, still quiet, but present in a way that feels more consistent. Before moving further, it helps to reflect on what this moment represents. After periods of environmental stress, recovery does not happen all at once. Instead, it unfolds gradually, often unevenly, with some areas improving sooner than others. Life begins to return in small, scattered ways before larger patterns emerge. You begin walking again, your pace calm. As you move, you notice more signs of activity. Animal tracks cross the ground in multiple directions. Some are fresh enough to hold their shape clearly. Others are older, softened by time. You crouch and examine one set. The impressions are deeper, more defined. The animal that made them likely moved with purpose, perhaps finding something it needed in this place. A simple but meaningful observation is that clearer tracks often indicate more consistent movement through an area, suggesting that conditions here support ongoing activity. You stand and continue forward. The land begins to slope gently downward, leading you toward another shallow basin. As you approach, you notice something encouraging. The vegetation here is slightly denser, still low, still modest, but more continuous. You step closer and crouch beside a cluster of plants. Their leaves feel stronger now, not brittle, not fragile, still delicate, but holding their shape more confidently. A curious detail is that plant recovery often begins with hardy species that can tolerate difficult conditions, gradually creating an environment where other plants can follow. You stand again and look around. There are more animal tracks here, more signs of movement, and something else. Footprints, human, faint but more numerous than before. You follow them slowly. They move through the basin, crossing near the patches of vegetation, then continuing outward. Not staying long, but clearly passing through. You pause, imagining the scene, a small group arriving, not just observing, but interacting, gathering, perhaps staying a little longer than before. You take a slow breath, letting the quiet settle around you, and you begin to sense how important places like this would have been. Not perfect, not abundant, but reliable enough to support brief moments of stability. Some researchers suggest that as conditions improved, early human groups may have begun to expand their movements again, reconnecting areas that had previously been isolated. Others propose that this process was slow and uneven, with some regions remaining difficult for longer periods. You begin walking again, leaving the basin behind. The land rises gently, and as you climb, you notice the ground feels warmer underfoot. Not dramatically, but noticeably. The air shifts as well. Still cool, but softer. You pause at the top and look out. The horizon stretches wide. The haze remains, but the light feels slightly stronger. The outlines of distant features appear more defined. You take a slow breath, and you continue forward. The rhythm remains steady. The calm remains, but beneath it there is a quiet sense of return. You walk across another stretch of land where vegetation appears more frequently. Small clusters, scattered but present. You notice how your steps feel more confident here, how the ground supports you more evenly. You pass another set of tracks, then another, each one reinforcing the same idea. Movement is increasing. Life is spreading. Carefully, gradually. You pause once more and look out across the landscape. There are still empty spaces, still areas where little seems to happen. But now those spaces are broken by points of activity, points of connection. You begin walking again, your steps soft, and you start to understand something more clearly. Recovery is not loud. It does not announce itself. It appears in small ways, in stronger plants, in clearer tracks, in more frequent movement. You take another step, then another. The ground remains firm. The air remains cool, but the world feels more open than before, more connected, more alive. And as you move forward, you carry with you the awareness that this period once defined by absence is slowly becoming something else. A time of return, a time of quiet rebuilding, a time when life begins once again to spread across the land. You continue forward, your steps slow and steady, the landscape opening gently beneath a sky that now feels a little less distant than before. The light still carries a soft haze, but it reaches the ground with more clarity, outlining shapes in a way that feels slightly more familiar. The air remains cool, but softer, less sharp against your skin. You walk across a stretch of land where the soil feels balanced, not too dry, not too loose, offering a steady surface beneath your feet. Small clusters of vegetation appear more frequently, forming quiet patterns that repeat across the terrain. You pause and look out across the horizon. There is movement. More than before, still quiet, still distant, but present in a way that feels reassuring. Before you move further, it helps to consider something important. Not all scientists agree on how severe this period truly was. While some interpretations suggest a dramatic reduction in human populations, others point to evidence that indicates a more moderate impact, with certain regions remaining relatively stable. You begin walking again, your pace calm. As you move, you notice how the land feels more connected than before. The scattered patches of life are beginning to form loose networks, small areas of activity, linked by movement and shared conditions. You pass a series of animal tracks that cross each other, forming a subtle pattern. You crouch and examine them. Different species, different directions. A quiet sign that multiple forms of life are using the same space. A thoughtful observation is that overlapping tracks can indicate shared resource areas where animals gather around reliable sources of food or water. You stand and continue forward. The ground slopes gently downward into another shallow basin. As you approach, you notice that the vegetation here is more consistent, forming a thin but continuous layer across the soil. You step into the basin and pause. The air feels slightly warmer, the ground slightly softer. You take a slow breath, letting the difference settle within you, and you begin to sense that this place offers a small but meaningful advantage. You walk slowly across the basin, your eyes scanning the ground. There are footprints here, human, more than before, not clustered, but more frequent. You follow them, noticing how they move in different directions, suggesting multiple paths rather than a single route. You might wonder what this means. Whether groups are beginning to encounter each other more often, whether the distance between them is shrinking. Some researchers propose that as environmental conditions improved, human populations may have started to reconnect, increasing opportunities for interaction and exchange. Others suggest that this process may have been gradual, with long periods of separation still shaping behavior. You continue walking, your steps soft against the ground. The basin curves gently, leading you toward a small rise at the far end. As you climb, you notice the soil remains stable, supporting your movement with ease. At the top, you pause and look back. The basin stretches behind you, its surface marked by subtle patterns of life. You turn your gaze forward. The land ahead continues in gentle waves, the vegetation appearing more frequently now, though still modest in scale. You take a slow breath, and you continue. The rhythm remains steady. The calm remains, but beneath it there is a quiet sense of reconnection. You walk across another stretch of land where the ground feels slightly warmer. The difference is subtle but noticeable. You notice how the wind feels less sharp, how the air lingers with a softer touch. You pass another set of tracks, then another, each one reinforcing the same idea. Movement is increasing. Presence is growing. A curious detail is that even small increases in population density can lead to more frequent encounters between groups, influencing the exchange of knowledge and resources. You pause once more and look out across the horizon. The landscape still holds wide open spaces, but now those spaces feel connected by movement, connected by life. You begin walking again, your steps steady, and you start to understand something more clearly. This period is not defined by a single explanation, not by one clear event or outcome. It is shaped by many factors: environmental change, adaptation, movement, connection, each one playing a role. You take another step, then another. The ground remains firm, the air remains cool, but the world feels more balanced than before, not fully restored, but moving in that direction. And as you continue forward, you carry with you the awareness that the story of this time is still being understood, still being explored, still open to interpretation, a quiet reminder that some chapters of history remain incomplete, even as the world itself moves on. You continue forward, your steps slow and steady, the land unfolding beneath a sky that now feels a little brighter, though still softened by a lingering haze. The air brushes gently across your skin, cool, but no longer as sharp, carrying a quiet sense of easing. The world feels different, not entirely changed, but shifting. You walk across a broad stretch where the ground feels firm and balanced. Small stones settled into the soil, forming a surface that supports your movement with quiet stability. You pause and look out across the horizon. There are more signs of life now, subtle, scattered, but present in a way that feels harder to miss. Before moving further, it helps to reflect on something deeper. There are moments in Earth's history where the evidence becomes thin, where the traces left behind are incomplete, and where understanding depends on careful interpretation rather than clear records. This is one of those moments. You begin walking again, your pace calm. As you move, you notice how the land carries fewer gaps in activity than before. The quiet stretches remain, but they are interrupted more often by small signs of movement. You pass a series of animal tracks that cross and overlap, forming a loose network across the ground. You crouch and study them. Some are fresh, others older, a layered record of presence over time. An important observation from archaeological research is that repeated activity in the same area can create overlapping traces, offering clues about how often a place was used and by whom. You stand and continue forward. The land begins to slope gently downward, guiding you toward another low basin. As you approach, you notice that the vegetation here is more consistent than in earlier areas, forming a thin but steady cover across the soil. You step into the basin and pause. The air feels slightly warmer, the ground slightly softer. You take a slow breath, letting the difference settle, and you begin to sense that this place has been used more frequently. You walk slowly across it, your eyes scanning the surface. There are footprints. Human? More than before. Some overlap, some diverge. Paths crossing paths. You follow one set briefly, then notice another intersecting it. You stop and look around. This is not a single journey. It is many. You might wonder what this means for early human life, whether groups are beginning to move within closer range of one another, whether this marks the beginning of renewed interaction. Some researchers propose that as conditions stabilized opportunities for contact between groups may have increased, leading to the sharing of tools, knowledge, and survival strategies. Others emphasize that such connections may have remained limited, shaped by distance and caution. You continue walking your steps soft against the ground. The basin curves gently, leading you toward a small cluster of rocks at its far edge. As you approach, you notice faint signs of fire, not as strong as earlier sights, but present. A subtle darkening of the soil. A few stones arranged loosely. You crouch and touch the ground. It feels compact, used, but not heavily. A curious detail is that not all fire sites were used repeatedly. Some may have been brief stops, leaving only faint traces that are difficult to interpret without careful study. You stand again and look around. This place feels like a crossing point. Not a place to stay, but a place to pass through. You take a slow breath and continue forward, leaving the basin behind. The land rises gently, the vegetation thinning slightly as you move upward. At the top you pause and look out. The horizon stretches wide. The haze remains, but the light feels clearer than before. The outlines of distant features appear more defined. You notice movement. Not just one or two distant figures, but several. Scattered, moving in different directions. Each one part of a larger pattern. You take a slow breath, letting the quiet settle around you, and you begin to understand something more clearly. This is a landscape where life is returning. Not fully, not evenly, but steadily. You walk forward, your steps steady. The ground beneath your feet feels stable. The air feels softer. The world feels more connected. You pass another set of tracks, then another, each one reinforcing the same idea. Movement is increasing. Paths are crossing. Presence is growing. You pause once more and look out across the land. There are still quiet spaces, still areas where little seems to happen, but now those spaces are part of a larger pattern. A pattern of return. You begin walking again, your pace calm, and you start to sense how this period, once defined by uncertainty and reduction, is gradually giving way to something new, something more stable, something more connected. You take another step, then another. The rhythm continues. The calm remains, but beneath it the story is becoming clearer, not complete, not fully understood, but forming, piece by piece. As you move forward, you carry with you the quiet awareness that this chapter of history is not entirely missing. It is simply incomplete, waiting to be understood through the traces it left behind. You continue forward, your steps slow, and even the land unfolding beneath a sky that now feels softer, clearer though still gently muted. The air carries a cool calm, but it no longer feels as sharp as it once did. There is a quiet ease returning, not fully, but enough to notice. You walk across a stretch of ground where the soil feels stable and supportive, the surface holding together in a way that allows your movement to feel more certain. Small clusters of vegetation appear more regularly now, forming subtle patterns that repeat across the landscape. You pause and look out across the horizon. There is movement, more frequent, more visible, still quiet, still distant, but unmistakably present. Before you move further, it helps to consider what happens after a period of strain. When conditions begin to improve even slightly, populations often respond by expanding. This does not happen suddenly. It begins with small increases, small movements, outward, small steps into areas that were previously difficult to use. You begin walking again, your pace calm. As you move, you notice how the land feels more connected than before. The gaps between signs of life are smaller, the distances between traces less extreme. You pass a set of human footprints that feel clearer than those you've seen earlier. You crouch and examine them. They are more defined, more consistent. You follow them briefly. They lead toward a gentle slope where the ground rises slightly. You stand and continue in that direction. A practical observation from archaeological studies is that clearer and more frequent human traces often suggest repeated use of an area, indicating that conditions support ongoing activity rather than brief passage. You reach the slope and begin to climb. The ground feels firm beneath your feet. As you rise, the view opens, and you pause at the top. The landscape stretches wide, but it feels different now, more active, more connected. You notice multiple paths crossing the land, faint, subtle, but present. Not just one route, but several. You take a slow breath, letting the quiet settle around you, and you begin to imagine what this means. Groups moving more freely, returning to areas, exploring new spaces. You begin walking again, following one of the faint paths. The ground beneath you feels smoother shaped by repeated movement. You notice how your steps align naturally with it, how it guides you without forcing direction. A thoughtful detail is that repeated movement across the same terrain can gradually form recognizable paths, even in environments where traces are usually short-lived. You continue along the path as it leads you toward another shallow basin. As you approach, you notice something encouraging. The vegetation here is more continuous, still low, still modest, but forming a broader layer across the soil. You step into the basin and pause. The air feels slightly warmer, the ground slightly softer. You take a slow breath, and you begin to sense that this place supports longer stays. You walk slowly across it, your eyes scanning the ground. There are footprints here. Human, many. Some overlap. Some form loose patterns. You follow one set, then another. They move in different directions, suggesting multiple visits, multiple groups, or repeated use over time. You stop and look around. This feels like more than a passing place. It feels like a place of return. A quiet but meaningful observation is that areas with reliable resources often become focal points for human activity, even in otherwise mobile lifestyles. You notice a small cluster of stones nearby. You move toward it. There is a faint darkening at the center. A fire site, not large, but used. You crouch and touch the ground. It feels compact, more settled than earlier sites. You imagine a group gathering here, staying a little longer, perhaps resting, perhaps preparing food, perhaps simply taking a moment of stillness in a world that has demanded so much. You stand again and look out across the basin. There are more signs of life here, more movement, more presence. You take a slow breath, letting the calm settle within you, and you begin to understand something more clearly. This is how recovery begins, not with sudden change, but with small repeated actions. Returning, using, staying just a little longer. You leave the basin and continue walking. The land rises gently once more, the vegetation thinning slightly as you move upward. At the top you pause and look out. The horizon stretches wide. The haze still softens the light, but the world feels more alive, more connected. You take another slow breath, and you continue forward. The rhythm remains steady. The calm remains. But beneath it, the sense of rebuilding becomes clearer. Paths forming, places returning, movement increasing. You take another step, then another. The ground remains firm, the air remains cool, and the journey continues through a world that is no longer defined by absence, but by gradual return. You continue forward your steps, slow and steady, the landscape unfolding, beneath a sky that now feels more open, even though the haze still lingers softly above. The light reaches the ground with greater clarity, touching the land in a way that feels more familiar. The air is still cool, but gentler, less insistent. You walk across a stretch of ground where the soil feels firm and balanced, offering a quiet sense of support beneath your feet. Small clusters of vegetation appear more frequently now, forming a patchwork of life that spreads across the terrain. You pause and look out across the horizon. There is movement, not just distant, but closer than before. Before continuing, it helps to consider how human life changes when conditions begin to stabilize. As environments improve even gradually, opportunities for innovation often follow. With slightly more reliable access to resources, people can begin to experiment, to refine tools, and to develop new ways of interacting with their surroundings. You begin walking again, your pace calm. As you move, you notice something different on the ground. A cluster of stone fragments, more concentrated than what you have seen before. You step closer and crouch. The pieces vary in size and shape. Some are sharp, others smoother. Several appear to have been worked intentionally. You pick one up carefully. The edge is precise, more refined than the fragments you saw earlier. A useful insight from archaeological research is that tool-making techniques often become more consistent and specialized over time, reflecting both experience and the sharing of knowledge within and between groups. You turn the piece slightly in your hand, then place it back. Looking around, you notice more fragments. This is not a scattered trail. It is a site, a place where tools were made or repaired. You sit back slightly, imagining the scene. Individuals gathered here, focused, working stone against stone, shaping edges, testing forms. You can almost hear the faint rhythmic tapping that once filled this quiet space. You stand again and look out. This place feels purposeful, not just a point of passage, but a place of activity. You begin to notice faint impressions in the soil, footprints, human, more numerous, more consistent. You follow them slowly. They move around the site, connecting different points, from one cluster of stones to another, from the center outward. You might wonder what this means for early human life, whether this reflects a growing confidence in the environment, whether people are beginning to spend more time in certain places. Some researchers propose that as conditions improved, humans may have started to invest more effort in tool production and refinement, indicating a shift toward more stable patterns of activity. Others suggest that such changes may have occurred unevenly depending on local conditions. You continue walking, leaving the tool site behind. The land slopes gently downward, leading you toward another open stretch. As you move, you notice more signs of activity. Animal tracks, human footprints, subtle paths forming across the ground, each one connecting to the next. You pause and look out across the landscape. It no longer feels as fragmented as before. The spaces between activity are smaller, the connections more visible. You take a slow breath, letting the calm settle around you, and you begin to understand something more clearly. Innovation does not appear suddenly. It grows from stability, from repeated actions, from the ability to remain in one place long enough to refine what you do. You walk forward, your steps steady. The ground beneath your feet feels warm compared to earlier stretches, not by much, but enough to notice. You pass another patch of vegetation and reach down to touch it. The leaves feel stronger, more structured, still simple, but more resilient. A curious detail is that as ecosystems recover, plant diversity can increase gradually, allowing for more complex interactions between species over time. You stand and continue walking. The sky above remains soft, but the light feels more present, more consistent. You notice how it outlines the shapes of the land more clearly now. You take a slow breath, and you continue. The rhythm remains steady. The calm remains, but beneath it, the sense of development becomes clearer. Tools becoming more refined, sites becoming more purposeful, movement becoming more connected. You pause once more and look out across the horizon. There are still quiet spaces, still areas where little seems to happen, but now those spaces feel part of a larger whole, a world that is slowly rebuilding. You begin walking again, your pace calm, and you start to sense how this period, once shaped by uncertainty and reduction, is giving way to something more stable, more creative, more connected. You take another step, then another. The ground remains firm, the air remains cool, and the journey continues through a world where new ideas are beginning to take shape quietly, steadily, one small action at a time. You continue forward, your steps slow and unhurried, the landscape opening beneath a sky that now feels lighter, though still softened by a gentle veil. The air moves across your skin with a calm, cool touch, no longer carrying the same sharp edge it once did. The world feels steadier, not unchanged, but more settled. You walk across a stretch of ground where the soil holds together with quiet strength, small plants forming a thin but continuous layer across the land. Their presence is still modest, but no longer fragile in the same way. You pause and look out across the horizon. There is movement, more frequent, more natural. Before you continue, it helps to reflect on something less visible. Not everything from this time is recorded in physical traces. Many aspects of human experience leave no lasting mark. Thoughts, conversations, shared knowledge, and stories pass through generations without being written down. You begin walking again, your pace calm. As you move, you notice a pattern in the land. Small clusters of activity connected by faint paths. Places where people paused. Places where they returned. Places where something was shared. You follow one of these paths, your steps aligning with its gentle curve. The ground feels smoother here, shaped by repeated passage. You notice how naturally your movement follows it, as if guided by something familiar. A useful insight from anthropological studies is that knowledge in early human societies was often transmitted through observation and repetition rather than written records. Skills, roots, and practices were learned by doing and by watching others. You continue forward the path, leading you toward a small clearing. As you enter, you pause. There are signs of use, not as strong as a permanent site, but present. The ground is slightly compacted. There are faint traces of past fires, and scattered fragments of stone. You crouch and touch the soil. It feels settled, used. You imagine a group here, not just passing through, but spending time, sharing information, learning from one another. A quiet but meaningful observation is that even brief gatherings can play an important role in the exchange of knowledge, especially in small and mobile populations. You stand again and look around. This place feels different from the earlier sites, less focused on survival, more balanced. You begin to notice how the land around it supports this. The vegetation is slightly more consistent, the ground more stable, the air softer. You take a slow breath, and you begin to sense how memory might have worked in a time like this. Not written, not recorded, but carried through movement, through repetition, through shared experience. You leave the clearing and continue walking. The land stretches ahead, forming gentle waves that guide your steps. You notice more paths now, faint but connected. Some intersect, some diverge, each one part of a larger pattern. A curious detail is that in some ancient landscapes, networks of paths can form over time, reflecting repeated movement between important locations, even in the absence of permanent settlements. You walk along one of these paths, your pace steady. The ground beneath your feet feels familiar. The rhythm of your steps feels natural. You pass another small cluster of stones, then another, each one suggesting use, not heavy, but repeated. You pause and look out across the horizon. The world no longer feels fragmented. It feels connected. Not fully, but enough to form a sense of continuity. You take a slow breath, letting the calm settle around you, and you begin to understand something more clearly. This period, once marked by uncertainty and reduction, is now shaped by quiet rebuilding, not just of population, but of knowledge, of connection, of shared understanding. You continue walking, your steps soft. The sky above remains gentle, the light steady, the air cool but comfortable. You notice how your awareness has shifted from searching for signs of survival to noticing signs of continuity. You pass another set of footprints, then another, each one reinforcing the same idea. People are moving, learning, remembering. You take another step, then another. The ground remains firm, the landscape remains calm, and the journey continues through a world where the missing pieces are not entirely lost, but carried forward in ways that leave only the faintest traces behind. You continue forward, your steps soft and unhurried, the landscape unfolding beneath a sky that now feels gently open, the haze thinning just enough for the light to settle more clearly across the land. The air moves calmly around you, cool, balanced, no longer carrying the same sense of strain. You walk across a stretch of ground where the soil feels steady and familiar, the small plants beneath your feet, forming a quiet layer of life that seems more at ease. You pause and look out across the horizon. There is movement, not scattered in the same way as before, but woven into the land. Before you continue, it helps to consider something less tangible. When written records do not exist, memory often takes other forms. Stories repeated across generations can preserve fragments of past experiences, even if they change over time. You begin walking again, your pace calm. As you move, you notice how the land carries a different kind of pattern now. Not just paths, not just sites, but connections, places that feel linked even when separated by distance. You follow a gentle curve in the terrain, your steps aligning naturally with its shape. The ground beneath you feels smooth-shaped by repeated movement. You begin to notice subtle signs of gathering, small clearings, faint fire marks, scattered tools, not isolated, but part of a wider pattern. A thoughtful insight from anthropology is that oral traditions can carry echoes of past events, preserving them in symbolic or altered forms, rather than precise historical accounts. You continue walking, your awareness shifting from the physical traces to the idea of memory itself. You arrive at a small open space and pause. The ground here feels used, not heavily, but repeatedly. You crouch and touch the soil. It feels compact, familiar. You imagine a group gathered here, not just for survival, but for sharing stories, experiences, observations of the world around them. A curious detail is that some ancient myths and legends may contain elements rooted in real environmental events, though interpreting these connections remains complex and uncertain. You stand again and look around. The space feels calm, balanced. You begin to notice how the environment supports this. The vegetation is more consistent, the air softer, the ground stable. You take a slow breath, and you begin to sense how memory and place might be connected, certain locations becoming associated with repeated experiences, certain paths carrying not just movement but meaning. You leave the open space and continue walking. The land stretches ahead in gentle waves guiding your steps. You notice how the paths you follow now feel more connected, less fragmented, more continuous. You pass another cluster of stones, then another, each one part of a larger pattern. You pause and look out across the horizon. The world feels different now, not just in its physical form, but in its rhythm, in its continuity. You take a slow breath, letting the calm settle within you, and you begin to understand something more clearly. Even in a time without written records, history still exists, not in exact detail, but in fragments, in patterns, in memory. You continue walking, your steps steady. The sky above remains soft, the light steady, the air cool and gentle. You notice how your awareness has shifted again, from observing survival to sensing continuity. You pass another set of footprints, then another, each one reinforcing the same idea. People are not just moving, they are connecting, sharing, remembering. You take another step, then another. The ground remains firm, the landscape calm, and the journey continues through a world where the missing chapter is not entirely lost, but carried forward in quiet, subtle ways that linger beneath the surface of time. You continue forward your steps, light and steady, the landscape unfolding beneath a sky that now feels more open than at any point before. The haze has not vanished, but it has softened, allowing the light to fall more clearly across the land. The air feels calm, cool but balanced. You walk across a wide stretch of ground where the soil feels firm and gently textured, supporting small but consistent patches of plant life. These patches connect loosely, forming a quiet network that spreads across the terrain. You pause and look out across the horizon. There is movement, not distant in the same way, closer, more frequent. Before you continue, it helps to reflect on how environments leave lasting marks on those who live within them. Even after conditions improve, the effects of past challenges can shape behavior, movement, and survival strategies for generations. You begin walking again, your pace calm. As you move, you notice how the land feels more stable. The gaps between vegetation are smaller, the paths more visible, the signs of life more continuous. You pass a series of footprints that cross one another, forming a subtle web across the ground. You crouch and study them, different sizes, different directions, a layered record of movement. A grounded observation from archaeological interpretation is that repeated human presence in an area can create overlapping traces that reveal patterns of use over time. You stand and continue forward, the land slopes gently guiding you toward another open area. As you approach, you notice that the vegetation is more evenly distributed here, covering the ground with a soft, consistent layer. You step into the space and pause. The air feels slightly warmer, the ground softer. You take a slow breath, letting the difference settle within you, and you begin to sense that this place supports not just survival, but comfort. You walk slowly across it, your eyes scanning the ground. There are signs of repeated use, footprints, faint fire traces, scattered tools, all connected. You imagine a group returning here more than once, staying longer, moving with less urgency. A curious detail is that as environmental conditions stabilize, human groups often begin to reduce constant movement, allowing for more repeated use of familiar locations. You stand again and look around. The space feels balanced. Not abundant, but sufficient. You take a slow breath, and you begin to understand something more clearly. The environment does not just influence survival, it shapes behavior. It shapes decisions. It shapes how people move, gather, and remember. You leave the open space and continue walking. The land stretches ahead in gentle patterns, the vegetation continuing to form a quiet network beneath your feet. You notice how the paths you follow now feel more defined, more consistent. You pass another cluster of stones, then another, each one suggesting repeated use. You pause and look out across the horizon. The world feels more connected than ever before. Not fully, but enough to create a sense of continuity. You take a slow breath, letting the calm settle within you, and you begin to reflect on how this period may have shaped the future. Some researchers suggest that events like these could have influenced human adaptability, strengthening the ability to respond to environmental change. Others propose that the impact may have been less direct, with many factors contributing to long-term development. You continue walking, your steps steady. The sky above remains soft, the light steady, the air cool but gentle. You notice how your awareness has shifted once more. From observing recovery to sensing long-term impact, you pass another set of footprints, then another, each one reinforcing the same idea. Life is not just returning, it is adapting, adjusting, learning from what has passed. You take another step, then another. The ground remains firm, the landscape calm, and the journey continues through a world where the echoes of past challenges remain quietly shaping what comes next. You continue forward, your steps slow, and even the land unfolding beneath a sky that now feels gently open, the haze, reduced to a soft presence rather than a constant filter. The light reaches the ground with a quiet steadiness, illuminating the landscape in calm, natural tones. The air feels balanced, cool but no longer pressing. You walk across a wide stretch of ground where the soil feels firm and supportive, small plants forming a quiet network that spreads across the terrain with increasing consistency. You pause and look out across the horizon. There is movement, not just scattered, but part of a living pattern. Before you continue, it helps to consider something essential. Even in times when life appears stable, it can remain fragile beneath the surface. Small populations, limited resources, and recent environmental stress can leave lasting vulnerabilities that are not immediately visible. You begin walking, again your pace calm. As you move, you notice how the land feels more alive than before. The vegetation is more continuous, the paths more defined, the signs of life more interconnected. You pass a series of animal tracks that cross and overlap, forming a subtle pattern across the ground. You crouch and examine them. Different sizes, different directions, a quiet record of activity. An observation grounded in ecological study is that recovering environments often show increased overlap in animal movement as species return to areas where conditions support their survival. You stand and continue forward. The land slopes gently downward into another open area. As you approach, you notice that the vegetation here is more evenly spread, covering the ground with a thin but steady layer. You step into the space and pause. The air feels slightly warmer, the ground softer. You take a slow breath, letting the difference settle within you, and you begin to sense how this place supports ongoing life. You walk slowly across it, your eyes scanning the ground. There are footprints, human, more numerous, more consistent. You follow one set briefly. It leads toward a small cluster of stones where faint traces of fire remain. You crouch and touch the ground. It feels compact, used. A gentle insight from archaeological thinking is that repeated use of certain sites can indicate a shift toward more predictable movement patterns, even in societies that remain mobile. You stand again and look around. This place feels stable, not permanent, but reliable. You take a slow breath, and you begin to understand something more clearly. Even after a period of uncertainty, life can return to a form of balance. But that balance is delicate. You leave the open space and continue walking. The land stretches ahead in gentle patterns, the vegetation continuing to form a connected layer beneath your feet. You notice how the paths you follow now feel natural, almost instinctive. You pass another cluster of stones, then another, each one suggesting repeated use. You pause and look out across the horizon. The world feels connected, active, calm. You take a slow breath, letting the stillness settle within you, and you begin to reflect on how close things may have come to being different. Some researchers propose that during periods like this, human populations may have reached very low numbers, creating a narrow path for future generations. Others suggest that the situation may not have been as extreme, with enough groups surviving in different regions to maintain continuity. You continue walking your steps steady. The sky above remains soft, the light steady, the air cool but gentle. You notice how your awareness has shifted once more. From observing recovery to sensing fragility, you pass another set of footprints, then another, each one reinforcing the same idea. Life continues, but it does so carefully. You take another step, then another. The ground remains firm, the landscape calm, and the journey continues through a world that has regained its balance, but still carries the quiet memory of how easily that balance can be disturbed. You continue forward your steps, soft and steady, the land unfolding beneath a sky that now feels open and calm, the haze reduced to a faint presence that barely softens the light. The brightness is still gentle, but it feels clearer, more certain. The air moves lightly around you, cool but comfortable. You walk across a broad stretch of ground where the soil feels firm and settled, supporting a quiet spread of vegetation that now connects much of the landscape. The small plants beneath your feet form a living layer that feels stable, no longer struggling in the same way. You pause and look out across the horizon. There is movement, not distant, not scattered, but woven into the land. Before you continue, it helps to consider something important. Even with all that has been observed, measured and studied, there are still parts of this story that remain unclear. There are questions that do not have final answers. You begin walking again, your pace calm. As you move, you notice how the world feels more complete than before. The patterns of movement are more visible, the paths more defined, the signs of life more consistent. You pass a series of footprints that cross one another, forming a layered pattern across the ground. You crouch and study them. Different sizes, different directions, a quiet record of many journeys. A grounded point from modern research is that interpreting these patterns is complex, as traces can represent activity separated by time, making it difficult to determine exactly when and how events unfolded. You stand and continue forward. The land slopes gently upward, leading you to a higher vantage point. As you climb, the ground feels stable beneath your feet, supporting your movement with quiet ease. At the top, you pause and look out. The view stretches far, the landscape feels alive, but also distant in time. You take a slow breath, letting the calm settle around you. And you begin to reflect on what is still unknown. Some researchers suggest that events like the volcanic eruption you passed through earlier played a major role in shaping this period. Others question whether the impact was as widespread as once believed, pointing to evidence that suggests variation across different regions. You look out across the land. It feels whole, but the path to this moment is not fully clear. You begin walking again, descending the slope with steady steps. The ground below feels warm compared to earlier parts of your journey. The air soft, the light steady. You pass another cluster of stones, another set of tracks, another faint path. Each one a piece of the story, but not the whole. A curious detail is that many ancient events leave behind incomplete evidence, requiring scientists to piece together multiple sources of information to form a picture that is always subject to revision. You continue walking, your awareness calm and focused. The sky above remains open, the light consistent, the air balanced. You notice how your perspective has shifted. From observing change to understanding uncertainty. You pass another set of footprints, then another, each one reinforcing the same idea. Life continues, but its history is not always fully visible. You take another step, then another. The ground remains firm, the landscape calm, and the journey continues through a world that has recovered yet still holds unanswered questions within its past. You pause once more and look out across the horizon. The land feels complete, but the story feels unfinished. You take a slow breath, and you continue forward, carrying with you the quiet awareness that some parts of history remain beyond full understanding, not lost entirely, but never fully revealed. You continue forward, your steps slow and steady, the land unfolding beneath a sky that now feels open and calm, the haze reduced to a faint softness that gently filters the light. The brightness is no longer distant. It rests comfortably across the landscape, touching everything with quiet clarity. The air feels balanced, cool but gentle. You walk across a wide stretch of ground where the soil feels firm and settled, supporting a continuous layer of plant life that spreads softly beneath your feet. The world feels whole again, though quieter than you might expect. You pause and look out across the horizon. There is movement, steady, connected, a living pattern that stretches across the land. Before you move further, it helps to reflect on the journey you've taken. You have walked through a time when the world felt thinner, when life seemed scattered, when the sky dimmed and the air cooled, and now you stand in a place where balance has returned even if the path that led here is not fully known. You begin walking again, your pace calm. As you move, you notice how the land feels complete in a quiet way. The paths are present. The signs of life are consistent. The patterns of movement form a gentle rhythm that carries through the landscape. You pass a set of footprints, then another, each one part of an ongoing story. A grounded understanding from modern science is that humanity survived this period and continued to grow, eventually spreading across the globe. Yet the exact details of how close early populations came to disappearance remain uncertain and continue to be studied. You take a slow breath, letting the calm settle within you, and you begin to sense something deeper, not just recovery, but continuity. You walk across another stretch of land where the vegetation feels stable and connected, forming a quiet network that supports life in subtle ways. You notice how your steps feel natural here, how the ground responds with quiet support. You pass another cluster of stones where faint traces of past fire remain. You crouch, briefly touching the ground. It feels settled, part of the land, a quiet reminder that small moments of survival have become part of a larger story. You stand and continue forward. The sky above remains soft, the light steady, the air calm. You take another slow breath, and you begin to reflect on what remains unresolved. Some researchers continue to explore whether the events you've walked through brought humanity close to its limits, while others suggest that the story may be more complex, shaped by many overlapping factors. You look out across the land. It feels complete, but the path to this moment remains partly hidden. You walk forward, your steps steady. The rhythm continues, the calm remains, and now as the journey begins to settle, everything slows just a little more. You find a quiet place, a gentle rise in the land where the view stretches wide and uninterrupted. You pause, you sit, and you let the stillness settle around you. The air moves softly. The light rests gently across the ground. The distant movements of life continue, but they feel far away, like a quiet background to your own stillness. You take a slow breath, and then another. And as you sit there, you begin to let go of the need to understand every detail. The missing pieces, the unanswered questions, the parts of the story that remain just out of reach. They no longer feel urgent. They simply exist, part of a past that continues to shape the present, even if it is not fully revealed. The wind moves gently, the land remains steady, and you allow your thoughts to slow, to soften, to settle. You notice the small details again, the texture of the ground beneath you, the quiet movement of the air, the distant rhythm of life continuing across the land. Everything feels calm, everything feels connected. And you realize that this is enough. You do not need every answer, you do not need every detail. The story exists even in its incomplete form. You take one final slow breath, letting it settle deep within you, and as you do, the world around you grows quieter still. The light softens, the movement fades, and the journey gently comes to rest. Sweet dreams,